Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 1101. Zuyu teaching sword techniques. Chen Pingan was called over by Chen Qingdu, the old great sword immortal again. In reality, there was only a single senior belonging to the scholarly lineage standing atop the city wall, that being Zuyu. He wasn't an innate sword talent, and he had actually started practicing sword techniques very late in life. Despite this, Zuyu had ultimately become the most skilled swordsman in the majestic world. Pei Qian was now a martial artist at the peak stage of the 4th tier, and she had sparred many times with Bai Lianshuang, a 9th tier martial artist at the Ning residence, allowing her cultivation barrier to gradually grow weaker. Cui Dongshan had been pulled aside by Chen Pingan for a private conversation, and apart from the matter regarding the books, they had also discussed some matters pertaining to Pei Qian's cultivation breakthrough. Would they follow Chen Pingan's established plan, where Pei Qian would hastily leave and return to Stalactite Mountain after witnessing the stunning scenery of the Sword Qi Great Wall, marking her study trip as complete, or would they make some slight changes to the plan, having Pei Qian and Mr. Zhong stay at the Sword Qi Great Wall for slightly longer to further temper their physiques as martial artists? Chen Pingan leaned toward the former because he had absolutely no clue when the next large-scale battle would break out. However, Cui Dongshan suggested waiting until Pei Qian advanced to the 5th tier of martial arts before she left the Sword Qi Great Wall. In any case, Mr. Zhong's mindset was now open, and his martial arts talent was also outstanding, so staying at the Sword Qi Great Wall for longer would allow him to advance at a pace almost visible to the naked eye. Thus, it wouldn't be a big problem for them to stay at the Sword Qi Great Wall for a period of time, as long as this period didn't exceed half a year. Even so, Chen Pingan still felt slightly anxious. With Cui Dongshan by his side, however, his anxiousness was nothing more than just that. Chao Qinglang was now a cultivator at the barrier of the abode tier, although he wasn't a sword cultivator. Looking at his background, his pursuit of knowledge, and his studies, Chao Qinglang was actually quite similar to Zuyu, with both of them being calm and composed as they cultivated their bodies, their hearts, and their Tao. Guozhujiu was the only daughter of sword immortal Guojia, and she was now a sword cultivator at the Sea Observation tier. Her cultivation talent was exceptional, and if it weren't for her being grounded at home back then, she should have been the one to face off against Lin Junbai during the first trial back then, someone who was very good at concealing his strength. Guozhujiu was clearly an outstanding innate sword talent. Yet after choosing a master, she surprisingly wanted to practice fist techniques instead. She wanted to learn paramount fist techniques that could summon booming thunder with a single punch. Pei Qian, do you know what the shortcoming of your self-created sword technique is? Zuyu asked. There was a sullen expression on Pei Qian's face. She hadn't imagined that her uncle master would dwell on her deranged demon sword technique so much. This technique was just for fun, and it truly wasn't something worth studying or talking about. What was the shortcoming? There was nothing good about the deranged demon sword technique to begin with. What did her uncle master want her to say? She was simply snacking on roasted seeds and blowing hot air in front of her companions, and she hadn't dared to do this many times after arriving at the Sword Qi Great Wall. Yet, why was her uncle master taking this so seriously? Guozhujiu leaned backward and glanced at the back of Pei Qian's head. Her senior sister wasn't tall, and, similarly, her courage truly wasn't great. She would become dazed when she saw the old great sword immortal, and she wouldn't dare to speak when she saw their uncle master. Looking at the current situation, Guozhujiu could be regarded as the pseudo-closing disciple of their master, so she needed to display some extra courage and dare to make up for what her senior sister lacked. Zuyu didn't pay any heed to Pei Qian's timidness and hesitation, and he continued, has any outsider told you before that your sword technique is too chaotic and complicated? And that it has a strong release but can't be retracted? Pei Qian mustered her courage and replied in a quiet voice, No, Uncle Master. No one has ever commented on the good or the bad of my sword technique before. Pei Qian's voice gradually trailed off as she continued, only Big Sister Zhou, that sword immortal on the swing, offered some comments that I couldn't understand. She gave me a present straight away during our first meeting, and I wasn't able to turn it down even if I wanted to. After hearing about this, Master told me to properly thank Sword Immortal Zhou before I leave the Sword Qi Great Wall, and to promise her that I would learn that sword intent. I don't dare to make any promises about how well I can learn that sword intent, but I'll make sure to study it in earnest. Zhuyu had never paid much attention to the intertwining golden threads formed from the many physical manifestations of sword intents belonging to sword immortal Zhou Cheng's lineage, but since Chen Pingan had already taught Pei Qian the necessary etiquette, there was no need for him to say any more. He simply revealed, "Your master has praised your sword technique in front of me more than once, saying that he dares to make the claim that in terms of sword techniques alone, Pei Qian is the most similar to his first senior brother. So I've always been very curious." Pei Qian hung her head in shame, feeling like she had betrayed her master's high hopes for her. "Sorry for disappointing you, Uncle Master." Zhuyu smiled and said, "It's a fortunate thing that no one has dared to utter such nonsense to you before. Too chaotic? Unable to be retracted? Otherwise, as your Uncle Master, I would have truly needed to step forward and speak up for you." He pointed into the distance and continued, "Pei Qian." Pei Qian raised her head and looked in the direction that Uncle Master Zhuyu was pointing. Chao Qinglang and Guozhuzhou also gazed into the distance, yet they were unable to see things too clearly. Guozhuzhou was able to see more compared to Chao Qinglang, not only because she possessed a higher cultivation base, but also because she was a sword cultivator. There were times when innate sword talents indeed possessed the right to look down on all of the other qi refiners in the world. However, it was a shame that this was the sword qi Great Wall. Otherwise, if an exceptional innate sword talent like Guozhuzhou were born in the majestic world, where sword cultivators were relatively rare, would she not become a direct disciple of some immortal sect's ancestral hall with ease? Would she not be a pillar talent whom the immortal sect would willingly spend a huge amount of natural treasures to cultivate? Only Pei Qian, who couldn't even be regarded as a qi refiner, saw things more clearly than sword cultivator Guozhuzhou. In the sky beyond the Great Wall, wisps of chaotic sword qi suddenly materialized between heaven and earth, rapidly twisting and moving around along irregular paths that were completely random and unpredictable. In fact, more than half of the sword qi were colliding with each other, and it was as if Uncle Master Zhuyu had casually tossed forth a gigantic net of sword qi after seeing a great demon passing by and treating it as nothing more than a small fish. However, this net of sword qi was extremely random and chaotic, and it was a huge strain for Pei Qian to look at. For the sake of easing the strain on Pei Qian's eyes, Zhuyu went the extra step to raise a hand and lightly form a sword seal, causing the tens of thousands of wisps of sword qi in the distant sky to condense into a small orb the size of a fist. This orb is very small, but it's more than enough to completely destroy the body and soul of a nascent tier cultivator with a single strike. Zhuyu said, "This is the kind of state that you should pursue with your sword technique. It's not that it's too chaotic, but rather, it's still not chaotic enough, far from enough. Only when you have a decent amount of sword qi, so much that it seems unreasonable, will you have enough sword qi. Normal sword cultivators shouldn't even think about this, nor will your Uncle Master provide them with this kind of guidance. Guidance should be specifically tailored for each person, and talking about this sword technique is coincidentally very suitable for Pei Qian. Fighting to the death with an enemy isn't the same as debating principles and reason, so is there any need to adhere to the rules and speak reason? If you want to kill someone, then simply pummel them to death. And if they want to draw their sword, well, if you possess enough sword qi, then they'll need to ask your sword qi first." Zhuyu made a cutting motion with 2 fingers, splitting the snow-white orb of sword qi into 2. A dazzling ray of light burst forth from the thin gap, eventually erupting loudly and dissipating like the rumbling thunder of spring. Astral wind swept by, creating a huge commotion that annihilated countless wisps of sword qi in the surrounding. These wisps of sword qi would slowly regather over the years, and if the conditions were suitable, they might be manipulated by the remnant intents of some primordial sword immortals, after which they might be nurtured and transformed into pure wisps of sword intent like those possessed by sword immortal Zhou Cheng's lineage. This would be like a rebirth, with a sword immortal's sword intent given a second life hundreds or thousands of years after their death. This is the next goal you should pursue after you achieve initial mastery with your sword qi. Zhuyu said slowly, "Even if I possess 10,000 pounds of force, if I'm able to kill someone with 1 pound or even 1 ounce of force, then that's the option I'll always take." "Uncle Master, can I choose not to kill other people?" Pei Qian asked carefully. "You shouldn't strike those who shouldn't be killed with your sword no matter how lofty your sword techniques are," Zhuyu replied. You can feel free to kill those who walk the fine line of partly deserving death and partly not deserving death. However, remember to never spare those who deserve death. And don't feel like you're taking advantage of your position to pick on other people simply because you possess a higher cultivation base. Don't feel like you can act nonchalantly and let them free with a casual smile. Things aren't so simple. Those around you who appear weak can actually be regarded as top-notch elites in the majestic world. And these powerful individuals pose a much bigger danger to society than ordinary people. You'll slowly grow to understand this after you travel more through the martial world and interact more with cultivators from the mountains in the future. If people voluntarily run into your sword, and if your principles and reasons are correct enough and your sword techniques are lofty enough, then don't hesitate and unleash your blade. Pei Qian wanted to say something, but she couldn't help but hesitate. It's naturally not enough for the scholarly lineage to focus on sword techniques alone, Zuiyu continued. At the same time, it's nowhere near enough if the principles and reasons in your heart merely act as a form of consolation and self-reassurance. If that's the case, what does it matter even if you possess the loftiest sword techniques in the world? Zuiyu turned around and called Chao Qinglang. Chao Qinglang immediately understood Zuiyu's intention and said, "It looks like Uncle Master is talking about sword techniques, but in reality he's drawing parallels with principles and reasons. Are many thoughts race around and intertwine with each other, and either they clash with one another and disperse, or like Uncle Master's orb of sword chi, they resonate and gather together, like those who share a similar great Tao. This is similar to the formation of a person's fundamental knowledge. When it comes to studying, one needs to tussle with sagely scriptures and noble principles, and one further needs to challenge one's own heart, the world, and even heaven and earth. Those who ultimately succeed can become mighty pillars between heaven and earth, with their swords holding apart the skies and lands, allowing them to pass on the torches of the most profound teachings." Zuiyu felt extremely satisfied, and he nodded and praised, "Sure enough, you're the most similar to me, so there's no need for me to say too much to you. You're able to understand all of this?" Chao Qinglang smiled and nodded in response. Zuiyu turned around and asked Pei Qian, "Are you going to be less receptive to your Uncle Master's explanations about sword techniques because of my comments to Chao Qinglang?" Pei Qian recalled her master's teachings about treating others with sincerity, so she mustered her courage and replied, "Feeling jealous is one matter, and learning sword techniques is another matter altogether. The two don't conflict with each other." Zuiyu nodded and said, "Very well. That's how it should be. It's fate for the two of you to share the same master, and it's not the case that you should become the exact same type of person who thinks the exact same way. In fact, there's no requirement for disciples to all take after their masters, and they should have the freedom to speak and act of their own accord as long as they adhere to the fundamental principles." Zuiyu turned his gaze to Guozhuzhou, with the most simple-minded of the three most likely being this young girl. She was listening to their conversation and would most likely remember everything, but her eyes and mind were both hovering over to her master. Her ears were pricked, and she planned to eavesdrop on the conversation between her master and the old great sword immortal. She naturally couldn't hear anything, but this didn't stop her from continuing to eavesdrop. Guozhuzhou immediately sat up straight upon noticing her uncle master's gaze, and she put on a serious expression and stated, "Each word spoken by Uncle Master is profound and hefty, and I'll make sure to properly catch all of them." Pei Qian sighed in grief when she saw this. This young girl truly had no regard for her seniors and acted with complete impudence. "Guozhuzhou, do you know what it signifies to have learned fist techniques, become Chen Pingan's disciple, and entered into the genealogical records of Downtrodden Mountain?" Zuiyu asked. "I don't know, Uncle Master," Guozhuzhou replied loudly. She spoke in a direct and righteous manner. Zuiyu felt like she was also quite similar to the younger version of him. This was very good. At this moment, however, he was standing here as a senior instead of a disciple, and he discovered that his master most likely hadn't felt this kind of headache because of him before. Indeed, even Zuiyu couldn't help but develop a slight headache at this moment. Forget about it. Chen Pingan could deal with this headache himself. However, the young girl had referred to him as Uncle Master, so he couldn't let her call him this for nothing, right? Zuiyu turned around to look at Cui Dongshan. Cui Dongshan giddily ran over to the city wall and asked, "What guidance do you have for me, Uncle Master? Choose a few random immortal treasures, and gift them to Guozhuzhou on behalf of your master. Make sure these treasures aren't too bad," Zuiyu replied. Guozhuzhou turned around slightly, holding up 2 fingers with one hand and 3 fingers with her other hand. As for whether she was giving Cui Dongshan a choice or asking for 5 immortal treasures in total, heavens knew what she was thinking, and heavens knew why she was thinking this. Cui Dongshan flicked his wrist, and a string of treasured light circled in the air as a dazzling and colorful treasure storage bracelet, a top-notch immortal treasure, was tossed toward Guozhuzhou. Guozhuzhou caught the treasure storage bracelet and exclaimed in astonishment, "You're genuinely giving this to me? I was just randomly asking for more, and I was planning to barter and haggle with senior brother." Even though the young girl said this, she didn't hesitate at all as she smoothly wore the bracelet on her wrist. Cui Dongshan smiled widely and explained, "This is called the 5 treasure bracelet, and it possesses a treasure forged from gold essence copper coins, the root of mountains and clouds, a jadeite bead that contains the essence of water fortune, lightning strike wood core, and a so-called lion insect refined by the 5 lightning righteous technique. This bracelet can be viewed as a treasured item of some agrarian immortal in the majestic world, and I was waiting for junior sister to open her mouth and ask me for a treasure. However, you didn't ask the entire time, and your senior brother was truly becoming very anxious. After we leave the city wall, I'll return this bracelet to you when Uncle Master can't see us anymore. Wearing it for a short moment is already good enough," Guozhuzhou secretly said to Cui Dongshan using her mind's lake. Cui Dongshan smiled and replied, "There's no need. Your senior brother is simply acting generous on behalf of someone else in any case, and I can simply tell that old bastard that I've lost the 5 treasure bracelet. This is a foolproof excuse. I can act generously for once junior sister can receive a valuable treasure, and that old bastard can weep in pain. This is killing 3 birds with 1 stone." Guozhuzhou was extremely confused. She shook her wrist, thinking that the dazzling and colorful bracelet was actually a little heavy. This treasure was too valuable, so she needed to ask her master afterward whether she could accept it or not. Cui Dongshan legitimately had a large number of treasures in his pockets. When first arriving at the Sword Qi Great Wall, Cui Dongshan had told the Taoist nun at the Taoist saber room that he was extremely poor, and that he had borrowed the flowing iridescent boat from someone else. He hadn't technically been wrong. His soul had split into 2, and since he owned the body, the treasures and minimization treasures theoretically belonged to Cui Chan. In the end, Zuyu said to Pei Qian, Chao Qinglang, and Guozhuzhou respectively, "You can practice sword techniques often, but remember not to truly wield a sword for no good reason. You should indeed learn from your master regarding this point. What can you master if you don't even understand the essence? The faster those around you progress, the more you shouldn't feel anxious and frantic. I'll visit your father for a chat." Chen Pingan summoned the talismanic boat gifted to him by spiritual master Huan Yun, bringing his 3 disciples back to the Ning residence. Before that, however, the talismanic boat had first traveled beyond the southern city wall, allowing them to see the large characters inscribed on the Great Wall. The horizontal strokes were like the great Tao of the world, the vertical strokes were like thundering waterfalls, and the dots were like immortal abodes inside which cultivators resided and cultivated. Cui Dongshan said he was going to wander around by himself, and he eventually made his way to that monk. He sat down cross-legged and said, "I need to offer thanks 2 times, once for myself, and once for the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent." The monk nodded and replied, "The human heart faces the light when sitting alone, transforming into a lion's roar when words are uttered." Cui Dongshan was unwilling to dwell too much on his own matters, so he changed the topic and asked in a sincere manner, "My grandpa eventually passed away in the Lotus Flower Blessed Land's Heart Manifestation Temple, but before that, he once wanted to pose some questions to the abbot, most likely wanting to ask about Buddhism. For some unknown reason, however, he eventually let this matter slide. Are you able to clear up my confusion about this?" Benefactor Cui likely wanted to ask whether such kinds of coincidences were predetermined. The monk replied. However, this question stopped at the tip of his tongue, and he let go of this thought as soon as it had appeared. He was truly able to let it go. Even Benefactor Cui was able to let this thought go, so why aren't you able to let these matters go? If today's Cui Dongshan is unable to let these matters go, then will yesterday's Benefactor Cui have truly let these matters go? Cui Dongshan frowned and said, "There's only a single world, no more and no less, and there's only a single river of time, traveling forward and never in reverse. If my grandpa has let go, then he's already let go. Why would this suddenly change because of me not being able to let go? The monk laughed loudly and recited a Buddhist chant before retracting his smile and remarking, Buddhism is boundless, so will it truly be confined to the notion of what comes first and what comes later? Will it not be able to accommodate those who are unable to let go? What does it matter if one is able to let go? And what does it matter if one is unable to let go? Cui Dongshan shook his head and replied, Stop playing word games with me. I have an extremely deep understanding of both logician knowledge and Buddhist teachings of Hetavidya. The monk brought his palms together and looked up at the sky, after which he retracted his gaze and looked at the vast expanse of land in front of them. He placed his right hand on his knee, with the tip of his fingers lightly touching the floor. He then raised his other hand and brought his index finger and thumb together, with his other fingers naturally extending outward like a blooming lotus flower. Cui Dongshan sighed and brought his palms together, nodding in acknowledgement before standing up to leave. There was a peaceful expression on the monk's face as he raised his right hand from his knee, turning his palm outward with his fingers facing downward. He smiled faintly and said, I've witnessed another lotus blooming in the mortal sea of suffering. Cui Dongshan descended the southern city wall and walked along the extremely wide carriageway, all the way until he reached the northern city wall. He then stepped forward and plummeted straight down, causing a plume of dust to shoot into the air at the foot of the Great Wall. An unsullied figure in white walked out from the swirling yellow dust, sprinting forward and occasionally leaping through the air. Looking at this, Zhu Mei was indeed very justified in her remarks about Cui Dongshan being retarded. No normal person would row when traveling on a talismanic boat, and no sane individual would hold a lightweight hiking pole and pretend to be exhausted when walking down a quiet alley with a young girl. Cui Dongshan didn't directly make his way to the Ning residence, and he instead jumped over a wall and snuck into some extravagant residence. He saw a sword immortal sitting in the corridor and drinking, so he squatted down on top of the railings and stared intently at the wine cup in the sword immortal's hand. Sword immortal Sun Juan smiled and said, Other things can be discussed, but I most certainly can't give this item to you, Imperial Preceptor Cui. Sword immortals are so stingy, Cui Dongshan grumbled in response. Sun Juan smiled bitterly and remarked, I truly can't believe that Imperial Preceptor Cui is the Imperial Preceptor. Cui Dongshan pursed his lips and said, And didn't everyone at the Sword Chi Great Wall suspect that you were a spy as well? But in actual fact, you're just a gambling addict who's helping other people host bets to make money and distribute money. Sun Jiyuan appeared slightly puzzled as he said, In reality, many people want to emulate Aoyang, but they're simply unable to do so very well. This relates back to the notion of balance explained by the many teachers. Many people end up as laughingstocks, especially since there's a huge condition for those trying to emulate Aoyang. That being, how can other people emulate his sword techniques and sword intent? How did Swordsman Aoyang of the Majestic World become Swordsman Aoyang of the Sword Chi Great Wall in 100 or so years? I'm sure both of us are keenly aware of this. I have a junior brother called Mao Xiaodong, and even though he's lacking when it comes to his studies, he's very good when it comes to teaching other people, Cui Dongshan said. My master is a quick and good learner, and everything in his sight is a natural treasure that can be used for cultivation. Sun Juan waved a hand and interjected, Don't say these kinds of things. I'm truly not accustomed to them. First you bring up junior brother Mao Xiaodong, and then you bring up your master, who's also the second shopkeeper of the wine shop. I don't even dare to continue drinking. Cui Dongshan tilted his chin upward, clearly unwilling to give in as he suggested, Then give me the wine cup. Why do you still need it if you aren't going to drink? Sun Juan looked at the young man who was squatting on the railing in an uncouth manner, and he could feel a headache starting to form. Just like Sword Immortal Ku Xiao from before, his expression also became slightly bitter. Cui Dongshan jumped down the railing and said, Everyone is hugely dissatisfied, yet they can't do anything about the old great Sword Immortal, so how are they going to vent their worries and frustration? Perhaps they can only drink wine and intoxicate themselves, becoming numb and dazed as they wait for death. This is better than remaining sober and facing certain death. Sun Juan didn't hide his true thoughts as he replied, How one thinks and how one acts are two completely different matters. Aoyang explained these principles to me before, one which I understood, and one which I committed to memory. Otherwise, the sword cultivator whom the old greatsword immortal killed with a single slash back then might not have been the high-profile Dong Guanpu, but instead the insignificant Sun Jiyuan. Cui Dongshan sat down in the corridor and leaned against the railing, saying the divine couple from the Ning residence fell in battle, while the Dong clan's Dong Guanpu was killed by one of our own. This was what my master faced during his first trip to the Sword Qi Great Wall, with the Ning residence declining as a result and the Dong clan remaining as powerful and influential as before, with no one daring to utter a single word against them. Who do you think feels the saddest as a result of this? Naturally, the old greatsword immortal, Sun Jiyuan, replied. Things are most troublesome when everyone appears reasonable. Cui Dongshan put his hands inside his opposite sleeves and stated. Sun Jiyuan smiled and asked, Imperial Preceptor Cui hasn't visited me today for the sake of whining and complaining, right? The two of us are simply engaging in a fair transaction. Some matters have been tangled messes for too many years, and even greatsword immortals won't necessarily have the ambition and motivation to untangle the chaos and make heads or tails of the situations. Their answers will undoubtedly be, what else can we do? We'll just leave it be. In any case, traveling beyond the city wall to kill demons is a habit that has become second nature, and after battling for a long time, it's something that will be treated as completely normal and justified. I, Sun Jiyuan, am someone who's afraid of death, right? But after truly ascending the city wall and traveling to the south, I'll also end up filled with vigor and adrenaline as I slay demons on the battlefield. It was always one battle every 100 or so years in the past, but disregarding the tragic and deadly battle following the 13 duels, the savage world attacked the Great Wall 2 more times in a measly 10 years, Cui Dongshan said. However, these weren't large-scale wars, and the savage world evidently wanted to nurture their troops and improve coordination between their various forces, using these wars as practice. Does this frighten you? Once they gather half the combat power of the savage world, or perhaps even the full combat power of the entire savage world, should the small number of people and flying swords at the Sword Qi Great Wall not feel afraid? This is the reason why we're incessantly grumbling, yet ultimately haven't done anything more, Sun Jiyuan explained. After all, the old greatsword immortal is still guarding the city wall. Then what if the ruler of the savage world, who's already disappeared for 10,000 years, reappears again? Cui Dongshan asked. What if someone is capable of challenging Chan Qingdu alone? What will happen to you and the other sword immortals at that time? Will you still have the courage to venture beyond the city wall? Sun Jiyuan remained silent. Cui Dongshan extended a hand and suggested with a chuckle, why don't we make a bet? If I've jinxed things, then this wine cup belongs to me. In any case, it's not of much use in your hands, and you might even need to use it to beg for a what it. If I haven't jinxed things, then I'll definitely return the wine cup to you in the future. Sword immortals enjoy long lifespans, so it won't be an issue for you to wait for a bit longer. Sun Jiyuan tossed the wine cup to Cui Dongshan and said, I'll give this wine cup to you regardless of whether I win or lose the bet. Aoyang once said that none of the gambling addicts at the Sword Qi Great Wall can achieve lasting victory, especially those who are sword immortals. Rather than losing this wine cup to those beasts from the savage world, it's naturally a smaller loss to lose it to the majestic world behind us. Both of these options are repulsive, and I'll treat it as a win to choose the less repulsive option. I'm waiting for the but. Cui Dongshan caught the wine cup and said with a smile. Sun Jiyuan nodded and stood up, replying, there is indeed a but. Have I agreed to travel beyond the city wall yet? Cui Dongshan nodded and said, I almost gave in to my urge to return the wine cup to you, bowing together with you to become sworn brothers and offering a chicken head and burning yellow paper to make this official. Sun Jiyuan chuckled and responded, Imperial Preceptor, saying something like this completely ruins the atmosphere. I can barely maintain my heroic spirit that I rarely ever display. Sword Immortal Son, I'll have to use Downtrodden Mountains rules to deal with you if you continue to behave in such an unrestrained manner. Cui Dongshan exclaimed. You're not Embroidered Tiger. You're not the Imperial Preceptor, Sun Jiyuan suddenly said with a serious expression. I'm Dongshan, Cui Dongshan replied in an awkward voice. Sun Jiyuan pursed his lips and he finally couldn't help but retort, and I'm actually Shiha. The young boy in white walked away, lying on the city wall and falling toward the other side. As he fell, he didn't forget to mumble, impudence, complete and utter impudence. Sword immortals at the Sword Qi Great Wall always like to bully other people, with their vitriolic words like blades that cut the heart. Lin Junbai didn't travel to the city wall to practice sword techniques for the past while, and he instead studied a Go manual by himself. Including Yan Lu, the other prodigies from the Shaoyuan Empire didn't dare to carelessly disturb Lin Junbai's process of repairing his mental state when they returned to the Sun residence to rest. Only Yan Lu had visited the listless Lin Junbai one time, with the latter seemingly more hospitable and sincere than before when he saw the former. Lin Junbai had set aside the Go manual and chatted with Yan Lu for a very long time. Yan Lu decided that he indeed needed to become allies with Lin Junbai. This wasn't a secret instruction from his clan. In the past, there were some qualms in his heart the entire time, and he had just hidden them extremely well. After all, Yan Lu had always viewed Lin Junbai as a barrier that couldn't be navigated around, with this barrier becoming increasingly troublesome as Yan Lu's cultivation advanced, and when he eventually became responsible for a portion of the Yan clan's matters. Lin Junbai would become increasingly powerful and influential in the Shaoyuan Empire, greatly hindering Yan Lu's rise. Now, however, Yan Lu was considering the problem from another angle. He could accept this reality and sincerely render assistance to Lin Junbai, and with Lin Junbai's discerning eye, he would understand that Yan Lu was an incredibly capable and reliable subordinate. Yan Lu hoped to form an alliance with Lin Junbai, but as a result of Lin Junbai's presence, Yan Lu would inevitably lose some hidden benefits. This being the case, he would make up for this through other means and from other people, and in the end he might even wind up with more benefits as a result. Having resolved this knot in his heart, Yan Lu became much more decisive and direct than before, no longer holding back when he conversed with Lin Junbai. Disregarding how severe the damage to Lin Junbai's Dao heart was, it was a fact that he was no longer perfect and flawless. This allowed Yan Lu to feel much more at ease. Lin Junbai had seen through Yan Lu's character a long time ago, so he wasn't necessarily surprised by the change in Yan Lu's mental state, and there wouldn't be any issues regarding his cooperation with Yan Lu. In the future, Yan Lu wouldn't be an insignificant individual in the Shaoyuan Empire. Senior brother Bianjing showed himself in a rare display today, playing a game of Go with Lin Junbai. You still haven't been repulsed enough by Yan Lu and the others? Bianjing asked with a smile. Lin Junbai shook his head and replied, quite the opposite. Their mindsets can be leveraged. Bianjing shook his head, holding a Go piece in the air and surveying the Go board as he said, well, I find them very repulsive. If a person sincerely feels like they're reasonable and correct, then they can be viewed as relatively decent people, with the only difference being their standpoint and the level of their knowledge. Their way of speaking might be different, but at the end of the day, reason is ultimately reason. As for whether a person's words are reasonable or not, that's actually secondary. For example, Jiang Guanxing. There are other people who decide that they may as well not speak. For example, Jin Junmeng. This is quite okay as well. As for the others, the large majority of them are speaking nonsense and they know this. This isn't very good, is it? Are they not aware of our current reputation at the Sword Qi Great Wall? Does the destroyed reputation belong to them? Who will remember them in the future? So, in the end, will the bumps and challenges of this trip to the Sword Qi Great Wall not be attributed to you, Lin Junbai? In that sense, you'll have delayed and ruined many of our master, the Imperial Preceptor's plans. I'll personally visit Master and ask for punishment when I return home, Lin Junbai said. He patiently waited for Bianjing to place his Go stone, smiling faintly as he continued. It's natural for people to seek a sense of support and belonging. Those in the group with superior morals will often become isolated and alone. One of the hidden targets of the Shaoyuan Empire was none other than Yu Zhuanfu. Lin Junbai didn't understand this, and he further found it inappropriate, especially since Yu Zhuanfu's fiancée was Huai Qian. No matter how proud and haughty Lin Junbai was, he was still keenly aware that he was definitely no match for Huai Qian right now. Not in terms of his cultivation base, his background, his mental abilities, his relationship with seniors, and his immortal fated opportunities. However, his master didn't explain the reason, so Lin Junbai could only wait and see how things panned out. His master had only uttered two serious remarks, saying after Yu Zhuanfu, who's pampered by Zhou Shanji, returns to the Yu clan and regains her status, she'll essentially possess half of the Shaoyuan Empire's national power. Even the stone lions sitting outside the gates of the large residences aren't clean. So will the imperial palace have a single clean tile in the eyes of the commoners? The imperial preceptor wasn't worried about Lin Junbai's cultivation, and he had simply posed a string of questions to the young man, using them to test his prized disciple. What do you think about viewing emperors and rulers as the paragons of virtue? How should we judge the successes and failures of rulers? How should rulers regard the well-being of commoners to live up to people's expectations? It looks like you're not facing too many issues? Bianjing asked. Lin Junbai smiled and replied, "Can I still be saved if even senior brother Bianjing is able to see that I'm facing big issues?" Bianjing placed his ghost stone and asked, "Do you know why you'll continue to lose?" "Yes, I do," Lin Junbai replied with a nod. Bianjing nodded and said, "Then I won't say too much." However, Lin Junbai dared to say with certainty that the answer in senior brother Bianjing's mind was definitely different from the understanding in his own mind. Bianjing and Lin Junbai continued their game of Go. Both of them were lost in their own thoughts. On the training ground in the Ning residence, a senior sister was having a scholarly battle with her junior sister. This was a very elegant scholarly battle. Pei Qian, a pure martial artist, was performing the deranged demon sword technique, while Guizhuzhou, a sword cultivator, was performing fist techniques. They didn't interfere with each other, nor did they fight each other. Chen Pingan left the wing room, planning to wait for Cui Dongshan to return. Only when Chen Pingan arrived near the training ground did the two young girls quickly stop their sword technique and fist technique. "Junior sister, your fist technique carries a hint of impressive sword technique, and this is a reflection of how you've diligently practiced sword techniques for so many years," Pei Qian said in praise. Guizhuzhou reciprocated the praise, saying, "There's peerless fist intent hidden within senior sister's sword technique, and this is as expected of senior sister, someone who's accompanied master for the longest." Pei Qian nodded and said, "Junior sister is very impressive. Judging by your progress, if you continue to practice fist techniques like this, you'll definitely be able to shatter several bricks with a single punch very soon. Senior sister is also amazing. If you practice sword techniques like this for several years, you'll definitely be able to leave destruction in your wake when you traverse mountains and cross rivers in the future," Guizhuzhou said in compliment. They studied under the same master, and sure enough, the relationship between them was very friendly and harmonious. Chen Pingan pretended not to see or hear anything as he walked past the training ground and made his way to the front gate of the Ning residence. After Chen Pingan left, Pei Qian raised her hiking pole high into the air, and Guizhuzhou shook the 5 treasure bracelet on her wrist. Pei Qian chuckled and said, "I also have a small bamboo bookcase." She then purposely paused for a moment before adding, "I'm not lying. You've seen it with your own eyes before." Guizhuzhou smiled widely and exclaimed, "I don't have a small bamboo bookcase." She then copied Pei Qian, pausing for a moment before saying, "Do you have this? Don't. You don't, right? Then do you want it?" Pei Qian was slightly taken aback. She felt like this young girl was a little stupid. Meanwhile, Guizhuzhou felt like the young girl standing in front of her was slightly simple-minded. Chen Pingan had already walked far away, but he secretly glanced back and smiled to himself. If things went smoothly, Downtrodden Mountain would most likely become very lively in the future. So when Cui Dongshan finally arrived at the front gate, Chen Pingan reached forward and grabbed his arm, dragging the young boy in white into the residence and saying as they walked, "You can accompany your master to the heavenly world's white jade capital in the future. Are you not going to say anything? Then I'll take that as a yes. It's a promise, okay? Shut your mouth yes like this. Very good." Fandach was still unable to overcome the barrier of the Dragon Gate tier and become a Golden Core tier cultivator. No matter how much wine Fandach drank, with him treating the others every time, he was still unable to become as thick-skinned and shameless as the second shopkeeper. He couldn't help but feel guilty, thinking that he had let down the Ning residence's training ground, and that he had wasted everyone's time by having them practice with him. Thus, Fandach would always be the one treating the others when they drank wine together. This was nothing, and even if Fandach weren't present, it would be enough as long as his money was present. Whenever they drank at Daizhang's wine shop, the cost would always be counted toward Fandach's tab. Among the group of friends, Dong Huafu visited and drank the most. Fandach had felt slightly confused in the beginning. Since when did the wine shop allow people to drink on credit? The answer was finally revealed to him when he asked, and as it turned out, Chun Sancho had made the decision to help him place a lesser heat coin at the wine shop. Fandach followed up by asking how much of the lesser heat coin was remaining, and it probably would have been better for him not to ask. A sense of grief immediately welled up inside him, and he immediately asked for several pots of Azure Divine Mountain wine in a rare display. He decided to drink until he was completely drunk. The two young boys who had become employees of the wine shop, Spirit Rhino Ali's Zhang Jiajian and Raincoat Ali's Zhang Chu, had now become friends who spoke about everything under the sun. During their private conversations, they had revealed to each other that their dreams weren't very grand. The storyteller on the small stool appeared less and less, so the children in the nearby streets and alleys naturally enjoyed fewer and fewer fantastical stories. Feng, the little boy who had some savings in his ceramic pot, and whose father made yangcha noodles in the wine shop, felt like he couldn't allow things to continue on like this. Even if the stories were bad, they were still stories after all. If worst came to worst, then he would directly pay the storyteller to tell them stories. And if one copper coin wasn't enough, well, his father was making a lot of money now, so he could occasionally toss Feng 2 or 3 copper coins. After 1 year at most, Feng ceramic pot would presumably struggle to house any more copper coins. Thus, feeling rich and brave, Feng mustered his courage and secretly ran to the street where the Ning residence was located with his ceramic pot, a street that he had never visited before. However, he still didn't dare to knock on the front gate after pacing back and forth for a long time. The gate was too large and the child was too small, and Feng felt like the people inside wouldn't be able to hear him, even if he knocked as hard as he could. When the storyteller had sat on the small stool, Feng, the first child to approach and speak to him, hadn't felt afraid at all. Now that the storyteller was hiding behind the tall walls of the Ning residence, however, the little boy immediately started to feel apprehensive. He squatted at the foot of the wall and basked in the sun for several hours, and before the sky became dark, he took his leave from the street where the blue stone slabs could almost be used as mirrors. The soles of his shoes would squeak whenever he twisted his feet, and Feng would entertain himself this way every once in a while. He didn't dare to do this too much, lest he disturb anyone and receive a beating. However, he immediately stopped when he reached the muddy dirt road of the alley where his home was located. His dad wouldn't care if his shoes became dirty, but his mom would care. Would it be fun for his bum to burn with pain? There were many times when his mom would start to cry as she hit him, while his father would always squat beside the door and remain silent. Feng would feel extremely aggrieved at those moments. He was the one hurting, so what was with his parents' reaction? How were his parents even more unreasonable than him, a little child? Feng walked onto the alley, where there was a decent number of children waiting expectantly for the good news. They were hopeful that they could once again listen to those stories set in faraway lands for free. The little boy was facing an awkward situation, especially since he couldn't reveal his cowardly nature and tell the others that he had only seen the large gates of the residence but not the storyteller inside. Thus, he apologized to the storyteller in his mind before acting heartbroken and explaining how the second shopkeeper was far too miserly, and how he had complained about there not being enough copper coins in the ceramic pot. He wasn't willing to tell stories now, and he cared more about money than his own conscience. The children started to scold and curse the storyteller with Feng and in the end, the children wound up feeling more disappointed than angry. After all, the storyteller hadn't finished telling the previous story yet, pausing it at the moment when the mountain god was forcing a maiden to marry him, and when a scholar was beating the drums outside the city god pavilion to voice this injustice. He needed to at least finish telling this story, no? Did that scholar end up saving the pitiful maiden whom he loved? Was the second shopkeeper not afraid of the scholar incessantly beating the drum during the pause in the story, all the way until the drum outside the city god pavilion broke? The little girl, who didn't look very adorable but always brought enough roasted seeds, was the most disappointed out of all the children. This was because after the storyteller ate more and more of her roasted seeds, she was even able to play the role of the lady on the sedan chair when the children played house now. Feng and the others would form a so-called sedan chair with their arms, and she would sit on top and sway back and forth. However, with the storyteller not appearing with his small stool and bamboo stick for a long time, this esteemed role was once again given to the little girl whom Feng and the others liked. As a result, she was relegated back to the role of playing the lady's maidservant. In any case, the storyteller had secretly promised her that he would be on her side the next time they had a snowball fight, so why was he going back on his word? She had spent a great deal of effort to persuade her parents to buy more roasted seeds, and if they couldn't bring themselves to eat these roasted seeds, then they could leave them until the new year. However, the new year didn't appear to be different or special in their hometown. This was in stark contrast to the festive New Year atmosphere that the storyteller recounted about his hometown, where the children would wear new clothes and receive red pockets from their parents. Each house would also put up door gods and couplets, cooking up an entire table of scrumptious dishes. Each time he finished telling a story or a small chapter of a story, the second shopkeeper, who liked to scare the children with anecdotes about gods and monsters but wasn't afraid himself, would also offer some remarks unrelated to the stories that the children would almost certainly not pay any attention to. For example, he would talk about the good points of the Sword Chi Great Wall, such as how people could drink together with sword immortals, and turning around they could see the sword immortals crunching down on pickled vegetables or slurping yangchan noodles. This was a very rare opportunity. Indeed, these kinds of scenes couldn't be seen anywhere else in the majestic world, not even if one was willing to pay exorbitant amounts of money. The storyteller would also say that no matter how many places one visited and passed by, and regardless of whether these places were better than one's hometown or not, one would ultimately only have a single hometown. This hometown was the place that people would think of the most. However, it was a shame that the children would quickly disperse once the storytelling session was over, with none of them liking to listen to these remarks. These were the smallest and most trivial matters in the world, and the small alleys where the children lived couldn't hold too much. As such, these trivial matters would quickly disappear when the wind blew or the rain fell. Even the children couldn't remember these matters, to say nothing of anyone else. These matters ultimately weren't the same as the stories told by Chen Pingan, where even the mountain spirits and water monsters responsible for carrying the sedan chairs would be given a name. He would further talk about their clothes and appearances, giving them opportunities to appear more in the story. In fact, Chen Pingan would even talk about the origin of the pickled vegetables and describe how they were incredibly crispy. The children would drool when they listened to this, especially since those at the Sword Chi Great Wall didn't celebrate the new year. But they would still have to shudder through the incredibly cold winters that froze their hands and feet. Die. The Sword Chi Great Wall sat on the border of the savage world, and over at the city wall, the sea of clouds appeared like layered steps carved out by drunken craftsmen. Here, the words and actions of sword immortals were almost all significant matters. Of course, some matters indeed couldn't be regarded as significant, such as sword immortal Zhou Cheng rocking back and forth on the swing year after year, Miyu not caring about day or night as he slept on a large bed of iridescent clouds, and the two enemies, Zhao Gai and Chang Quan, spitting at each other after they drank wine. Including those from the Great Emblem Sword sect, many sword cultivators from the large immortal forces were already preparing to leave the Sword Chi Great Wall in waves. Regarding this, the elderly sword immortals and the large clans of the Sword Chi Great Wall, such as the Chang clan, the Dong clan, and the Qi clan, didn't have any objections. After all, it was already more than enough help that they had participated in one large-scale battle alongside the local sword cultivators of the Sword Chi Great Wall. Afterward, it was only because the subsequent large-scale battle had broken out so soon that the return journey of many outsider sword cultivators had been delayed. Someone had once joked that relationships built with sword immortals from the Sword Chi Great Wall were the most useless relationships in the world. However, this couldn't be taken seriously, and anyone who did take it seriously would be an absolute fool. Moreover, the person who uttered this remark wasn't necessarily the one who killed the most demons, but he was definitely the one who killed the most powerful demons. Otherwise, how could he have inscribed the newest colossal character on the Great Wall? There was the greatest number of outsider sword cultivators from the northern complete reed continent, but not all of them returned home to the majestic world, with some such as the sect leader of the Great Emblem Sword sect choosing to remain at the Sword Chi Great Wall. There were several other sword immortals from the northern complete reed continent who chose to stay, with all of them being relatively older cultivators with higher cultivation bases. Meanwhile, those who left were all relatively young. Of course, there were also some who traveled to the Sword Chi Great Wall alone, such as Duckweed Sword Lakes Li Kai, the Southern World Continent Sword Immortal Yuan Qingshu, and so on. Apart from these sword immortals, Many Earth immortals and sword cultivators from other immortal forces of the 9 continents also decided to stay. Dai Zhang's wine shop grew bigger and bigger, eventually purchasing the 2 neighboring shops and gaining 2 additional walls for customers to hang their safety tablets. Thus, sword cultivators from the northern complete reed continent, especially the disciples of the Great Emblem Sword sect, were able to leave their names and comments in the wine shop. Whenever they visited the wine shop to drink, they would often drag along the local sword cultivators with whom they had fought side by side in the 2 large-scale battles, eventually creating a new trend in the wine shop. The outsider sword cultivators and local sword cultivators who had life and death relationships would inscribe characters on the 2 sides of one safety tablet, with some politely offering auspicious words, some cursing in an uncouth manner, and some leaving behind drunken remarks. There were also some who directly copied phrases from the seal manual of the 200 sword immortals or the folding fans, and all kinds of other strange and wonderful remarks were left on the safety tablets. On one of the safety tablets, a young golden courtier cultivator who was the direct disciple of some sect leader in the circling Ascension continent had inscribed his name on the front surface and also written, "I've looked through all of the safety tablets, so dare I say, what does it matter if the sword skills of those from the majestic world are inferior to those from the sword chi great wall? Our writing is a great deal better." On the backside, a nascent tier sword cultivator from the sword chi great wall had written his name along with a comment. His name was relatively straight and proper, but the remaining characters quickly deteriorated into a crooked mess, reading, "Your handwriting is poor, just as poor as the second shopkeeper's skill in selling wine. We won't complain even if a dozen more of you come to the sword chi great wall." Suiyu was currently discussing some sword technique comprehensions with Wei Jin, and the latter was just about to stand up and take his leave when the old great sword immortal appeared. Chen Qingdu waved a hand and said, "You can stay here. In my eyes, the sword skills of you 2 are around the same level." Wei Jin smiled bitterly upon hearing this. Even if the old great sword immortal wanted senior Suiyu to feel ambitious and motivated again, there was no need to drag him into the equation, was there? Chen Qingdu didn't beat around the bush and he said frankly, "I actually have a request to make. In fact, it's not exactly right to call this a request, as one is an order from your master, and one is an expectation of mine. It's up to the 2 of you whether you listen or not, and it's up to my sword how I respond afterward." Wei Jin felt very helpless. There was clearly no room for discussion, at least not for him. It was temporarily unknown how senior Suiyu would respond. "Why didn't Master tell me himself?" Suiyu asked. Chen Qingdu smiled and replied, "What's the point of a master uttering words that his disciple won't listen to? If I heard this, then wouldn't the most reasonable old scholar in the majestic world turn into someone who couldn't discipline his own student? It's indeed the case that I've caused Master to worry," Suiyu conceded. Singing praises of the old scholar was quite effective when it came to dealing with Suiyu. In fact, it was the only effective method and the most effective method. Chen Qingdu then turned to Wei Jin and said, "Wei Jin, you might not be convinced and willing if I try to persuade you now. So you can listen to my words after you participate in another large-scale battle. You'll have 3 places to choose from after you leave the Sword Chi Great Wall: the Southern World Continent, the Circling Ascension Continent, and the Golden Armor Continent. You can treat this as a holiday. Wei Jin from the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's Wind Snow Temple shouldn't be a love-struck and heartbroken man. And in any case, will it make much of a difference where you're feeling heartbroken? There's no need to stay at the Sword Chi Great Wall. And it's not like the lady whom you love can see you if you're too far away." The old great sword immortal chuckled and continued, "I'm naturally speaking to you in such a blunt manner because your sword skills are even poorer than those of Suiyu. So remember to practice the sword more when you leave the Sword Chi Great Wall in the future. Once your sword skills improve at least to the same level as Suiyu, then I won't be as pushy the next time." Wei Jin smiled bitterly and asked, "Is this the only option, old great sword immortal? Why are you asking me? Go and ask your sword." Chen Qingdu tilted his chin and replied. Wei Jin felt even more helpless. The old great sword immortal didn't stop Wei Jin from leaving this time. Only the 2 individuals with lofty sword skills remained. Your junior brother didn't agree to lighting a bonded candle, but he engaged in a small transaction with me. When he enters the battlefield in the future, I'll either save him once, or I'll save a person he wants to save once, Chen Qingdu revealed. He then smiled and continued, He who is afraid of death suddenly isn't afraid of death. And the normally taciturn Zui Yu is surprisingly saying so much. Just what are the disciples belonging to the scholarly lineage thinking? It's actually very easy to find out, Zui Yu replied. Chen Qingdu could naturally find out if he became a disciple of the scholarly lineage. Chen Qingdu chuckled and said, I suggest that you don't speak your thoughts out loud. Your juniors are still at the Sword Qi Great Wall, so it would be quite bad for their senior, whom they view as invincible, to be beaten black and blue. It wasn't that Zui Yu didn't care about the old great sword immortal's veiled threat. But there was simply a more important matter that he cared about right now. What should be done if he comes? Zui Yu asked. Chen Qingdu held one hand behind his back and stroked his beard with his other hand, after which he ran his hand through his hair and replied, Our doors are wide open, and we'll entertain our guest for as long as he's willing to stay. When facing enemies, sword immortals will only complain about there not being enough great demons to kill. Do you not understand even this? Zui Yu nodded and said, That makes sense. Oh, you finally want to unleash your blade for your own sake? Chen Qingdu asked in amusement. Those belonging to the scholarly lineage only speak reason and don't make nonsensical boasts, and as the first senior brother, I'll let the others know that my title as the most skilled swordsman in the majestic world isn't an exaggeration, but instead underselling me, Zui Yu said. You still want a loftier title? Chen Qingdu asked with a smile. How lofty should it be? Perhaps you want to stand on your tippy toes and crane your neck to reach my shoulder? Chen Qingdu, let's create an isolated space and have a fight, Zui Yu said. Chen Qingdu clasped his hands behind his back and walked away. Zui Yu closed his eyes and continued to nurture his mind and his sword intent. The next large-scale battle would be most suitable for unleashing the full power of his sword. Extremely far away in the distance, sword immortal Zhou Cheng was still rocking back and forth on the swing, humming a difficult-to-understand song from some foreign land. This was a song that a young outsider had taught her many years ago, when she was still a young girl. In fact, he hadn't technically taught her, but he had liked to sit near the swing and hum the song to himself. Zhou Cheng hadn't liked the song back then, and she most definitely hadn't wanted to learn it. There hadn't even been enough time to practice sword techniques, so would there have been enough time to learn these useless things? Afterward, Zhou Cheng had heard about the notion of vagrant cultivators for the first time, and the young cultivator had also explained his reason for coming here, saying that he wanted to take a look at the hometown in his heart. He didn't have any feelings for it, but he simply wanted to come here to take a look. Great sword immortal Lu Ji walked over to the swing and grabbed one of the ropes, gently rocking it back and forth. Zhou Cheng didn't turn around and she asked in a soft voice, Big Sister Lu. Someone was willing to risk their life to come here and look at the hometown in their heart. So why aren't you willing to go and look at the hometown in your heart? You won't die, and you've also accumulated so much military merit in any case. And the old great sword immortal agreed a long time ago that he wouldn't stop you as long as you had enough military merit. Lu Ji was a slender woman who appeared slightly skinny, with her cheeks subtly sunken in. However, her skin was pale and her forehead was especially smooth and shiny, almost as if it had accumulated the soft moonlight for many years. She couldn't be regarded as beautiful, but as she quietly stood beside the swing, her aura was similar to that of Zui Yu's given that he didn't suppress his sword qi. Lu Ji shook her head and replied, The reason we made that agreement was so that I could find myself some other things to think about beyond practicing the sword. Being able to do something doesn't mean I definitely have to do it. Zhou Cheng didn't say anything else. Lu Ji gently rocked the swing and continued, After I was able to rightfully go to Stalactite Mountain, my thoughts about that reached their conclusion. Now, my thought is about going to the south to two places, very far away. One is to have my horse drink at Elite Cavalry River, and the other is to stand with my sword on Holding Moon Mountain. Zhou Cheng turned around and asked with a smile, You like that man who can't say any good words? Lu Ji shook her head and replied, It's not the case that women necessarily need to like men. I wouldn't like myself to like someone else, and I would only like myself to not like another person. Big Sister Lu, you're truly speaking like those people from the majestic world, Zhou Cheng commented with a smile. Zhou Cheng, what will you do if this swing disappears one day? I'll be dead at that time, so there won't be any need to worry about it. Is there any need to go so far because you like a person? It's not that I like him a lot or anything. Everything is gone, and I'm the only person left from my lineage, so what else can I think about? Big Sister Lu is extremely talented, so you can have ambitions to chase. It's a different story for me, and it won't be of any use for me to have these ambitions, so I won't even think about them. Lu Ji gazed toward the south and said with an apathetic expression, there are more than just one or two sword immortals who can't do anything but wait for death. Say, isn't this comical? Zhou Cheng didn't say anything, nor did she smile in response. The Northern Complete Reed Continent's sword immortal Li Kai was someone who wasn't willing to settle down. She was challenging the great emblem sword sex Han Huizi to a sword duel today, and she would challenge some other sword immortal to a sword duel tomorrow. If she couldn't find a sword immortal to challenge, then she would go and pick on nascent tier sword cultivators, hollering that these people couldn't even beat a woman. Not only that, but they didn't even dare to accept her challenge. Could they still be regarded as true men? Where were their balls? Many nascent tier sword cultivators would accept her challenge in anger, and after losing, they would run away and ask their friends for help. Indeed, who didn't have a few sword immortal friends at the Sword Chi Great Wall? Things would be okay if Li Kai won, and she would move on and find another sword immortal to challenge. If she lost, however, she would seek out the nascent tier sword cultivator again. Repeating this process 2 or 3 times, the nascent tier sword cultivators would eventually wear aggrieved expressions, with their sword immortal friends no longer willing to meet them. One of the nascent tier sword cultivators said to Li Kai that she couldn't always target him like this, so he secretly introduced her to another nascent tier sword cultivator, saying that he had even more sword immortal friends. And thus Li Kai sincerely fell in love with the Sword Chi Great Wall. She could enjoy endless fights, and she wouldn't need to worry about anything regardless of whether she won or lost. This was significantly better than fighting other people in the Northern Complete Reed Continent, where she needed to restrain herself due to relationships, sensibilities, and whatnot. Li Kai almost wanted to find a random man to marry, and that way she could stay here and not return to the Northern Complete Reed Continent. Upon thinking of this, however, she would feel like she was betraying Jiang Shangzhen. Thinking a bit more, she rationally told herself that a man like Jiang Shangzhen would never reserve his romantic feelings for a single woman, so what was the point of liking him? Was that not humiliating herself? However, whenever she sat atop the city wall, or whenever she was nurturing her wounds at the Myriad Ravine residence, she would think about this again and again and realize that she was unable to sever her feelings for him. This caused Li Kai to feel so vexed that she almost wanted to drink herself to death. Li Kai was temporarily staying at the Myriad Ravine residence, not far away from the armory that had already become the Great Emblem Sword Sect's private residence. It was even closer to Cloudstop Pavilion, where all of the main structures were carved from jade. Li Kai thus sent a letter to Jiang Shangzhen, asking him to use his money to purchase this residence. However, she was afraid that he wouldn't be willing to spend, so she doubled the asking price of the residence in the letter. An emaciated old man with a bulbous nose held a pot of wine in his hand and left his residence in a rare sight, shakily making his way to the city wall to enjoy the scenery. He seldom came here due to the strong wind. He walked past the unpolished jade tier sword cultivator who had an extremely long sword tassel and walked with his sword dragging along the ground, and even though the two of them were actually extremely far apart due to the great width of the city wall, the initially adrift Wu Changpei suddenly turned around and stared intently at the old man, with the rims of his eyes becoming red as he shouted in anger, "Piss off, you old bastard." The old man had the nickname of Old Deaf Guy at the Sword Chi Great Wall, something that didn't sound impressive at all. However, he was legitimately one of the 10 most powerful people at the Sword Chi Great Wall, and this was not to mention his rank being above that of Nalan Xiaowei and Lu Ji. To put things bluntly, the Sword Chi Great Wall was a place where anyone could suddenly enter a bad mood. So Wu Changpei's incredibly offensive remark was more than enough reason for the old deaf guy to draw his blade and attack. Anyone who dared to stop him would also become his target. However, the old deaf guy truly seemed like a deaf person, and not only did he not say anything, but he even started to walk more briskly, instantly disappearing into the distance like a puff of smoke. Only then did Wu Changpei lower his head and continue forward. The old deaf guy stopped many times as he walked, and he remained silent regardless of whether people greeted him or ignored him. He stopped and stood still after arriving before the monk, and he said in a hoarse voice, "Teach me more about Buddhism. It's not like I can hear you anyway." Already sitting on the end of the city wall, The monk heeded the old deaf guy's request and expounded some Buddhist teachings. There was hazy white mist around the monk's straw mat, and wisps of golden light would occasionally dazzle before dispersing again. These were mystical sights of splashes in the river of time, resulting from its obstruction by some invisible barrier. The monk reached forward and cupped some water in his hand, but he was still a fraction slower than the dispersing wisp of golden light. He retracted his hand, having failed to achieve his goal one time. The old deaf guy then made his way to the other end of the city wall to visit the Confucian sage, who had once been a talented Buddhist monk. He essentially uttered the same words again, and the Confucian sage also expounded some teachings. The old deaf guy nodded before seeking out the old Taoist priest who was located extremely high up in the sea of clouds. He was the first disciple of the Tao ancestors' first disciple, and after he said a few words, the old deaf guy left the city wall and went back to the dungeon that he had been responsible for guarding for several thousand years. The dungeon didn't have a name, and strangely enough, the higher the cultivation base of the great demons, the closer to the surface of the ground they were suppressed and locked up. The old deaf guy walked past the rows of cells, completely unable to hear the abuse and ridicule hurled his way. As for the furious rampages of the great demons causing the entire dungeon to shake, the hunchbacked old deaf guy paid absolutely no heed to this, not even raising his head to take so much as a single glance. Because of this, he wasn't able to see the vicious resentment in the eyes of the demons either. In the end, the old deaf guy navigated to the lowest level of the dungeon to visit the weakest demons. He taught them sword techniques, not caring whether these demons learned or not. They couldn't escape the fate of death anyway, and it was difficult to say whether dying earlier or later would be more fortunate. The old great sword immortal had tasked him with one matter before, telling him that on the day he went to the city wall to fight, he needed to remember to kill all of the demons in the dungeon, although he could spare the lives of 3 golden core tier demons using his accumulated merit according to their agreement from before. The old deaf guy would have truly gone deaf if he had failed to hear and acknowledge even this. Indeed, a dead ascension tier great demon would naturally be deaf, no? The old deaf guy didn't feel like there was anything for him to complain about. After picking and choosing for thousands of years, he had settled once again on 3 talented demons. The problem was, regardless of how talented the demons were and how much they suppressed their cultivation, they would eventually be forced to break through once enough time passed. The reason for this was very simple. How could they survive hundreds or thousands of years if their cultivation base wasn't high enough? They would die of natural causes if their cultivation base wasn't high enough. Several of them had died over the course of many years, causing the old deaf guy to feel a sense of pity many times. He had waited and waited, and after waiting for such a long time, his 3 surviving unofficial disciples were the juniors of countless senior brothers and senior sisters who had secretly practiced sword techniques and then secretly passed away. Of the 3 unofficial disciples, one was at the abode tier, one was at the dragon gate tier, and one was at the peak stage of the golden core tier and on the verge of going crazy. The old deaf guy was very open and honest when it came to taking disciples, and those who advanced to the nascent tier would face death. Thus, the demons could carefully consider how they advanced. At the Sword Chi Great Wall, apart from the city Mirage Market in the north, the Armory, the Myriad Ravine Residence, Cloudstop Pavilion, and other similar residences left behind by sword immortals, there were also some other sites that could just barely qualify as famous landmarks. When it came to restricted areas, however, there were 3 other locations in addition to the dungeon guarded by the old deaf guy. There was the Sword Market managed by the Dong clan, the Garment Market managed by the Qi clan, and the Alchemical Pill Market managed by the Chang clan. The swords forged at the Sword Market were never very good, and they were ordinary swords that couldn't even qualify as immortal treasures. Sword immortals could take them or leave them, and sword cultivators who ascended the city wall would all be given one for free. Similarly, they could also take them or leave them, whether through clan inheritance or by spending a huge sum of money to purchase them from the majestic world. Disciples and descendants of large clans could display their impressive abilities if they managed to obtain a good sword. In reality, however, many sword immortals especially liked to carry swords forged by the Sword Market, using them to slay countless demons. The Tao robes made by the Garment Market also weren't very high in quality. In fact, they looked very basic and unserious. Despite this, it was extremely clear that the Sword Market and the Garment Market were the most indispensable parts of the Sword Chi Great Wall. Sword immortals didn't fall from the sky here, and they were all sword cultivators who had advanced one tier at a time. The only difference was how quickly or slowly each person advanced. The function of the alchemical pill market was the most straightforward. The spoils of battle and the corpses of the demons on the battlefield to the south would all be fully utilized. Not only that, but the alchemical pill market also had the most diverse mix of people from all over the place. Cultivators from the alchemical branch and the talismanic branch numbered the most, and some people voluntarily came to the alchemical pill market to sign a contract perhaps for 100 years or several hundred years, only leaving after they made enough money. There were also outsiders who had been kidnapped and forcefully brought here, and there were hidden elites or refugees from the majestic world who had come here to flee from calamity. The Sword Chi Great Wall relied on this alchemical pill market to perform transactions of various values with the many intercontinental ships that had come from the majestic world and docked at Stalactite Mountain. At the same time, the alchemical pill market also had a very close relationship with the dungeon managed by the old deaf guy. After all, the blood, skeletons, and demon core shards of many great demons could be regarded as paramount treasures in the mountains. It was very easy for anyone to enter the 3 extremely strict and tightly guarded restricted areas, but it was incredibly difficult for anyone to leave, even if one were a sword immortal. Among those who resided in the strokes of the colossal characters engraved on the southern Great Wall, there was a type of sword cultivator who would distance themselves from the matters of the city. Even when they occasionally visited the city wall and the areas to the north, they would do so secretly and without causing a single ripple. They were responsible for collecting money from the savage world. They were similar to the border scouts of mortal empires in the majestic world. Thus, the weakest of them were still Dragon Gate tier sword cultivators, and each time they ventured south, they would definitely be led by a sword immortal. In the past, the greatest ambition of Chan Sanxiu and Little Tsiu, the former who hailed from a top-notch clan and the latter who had worked hard and risen from an impoverished background, had been to venture south to collect money. The sword cultivator who ventured south the most and ventured the furthest south liked to refer to himself as a sword practitioner, saying that he was carefree not for the sake of attracting the gazes of fine maidens, but simply because he liked the martial world. The savage world to the south was a large martial world where they could encounter many interesting things. After uttering these bold words that stirred the souls of the younger generation, however, the sword cultivator who said these things would giddily run to the city to drink, going wherever he could attract the most gazes of fine maidens. Each time he returned inebriated and reeking of wine, he would smile widely and say to some of the little bastards whom he disliked that some of them had almost run off to dob him into his father's or even his old ancestors. Thankfully, however, he was filled with a righteous aura and able to control himself, so beauty and seduction wouldn't be able to approach him at all. If a junior talked back, the sword cultivator, who was never willing to suffer a loss, would name some person from the junior's clan and remark that they couldn't even be regarded as a beautiful woman. However, this didn't matter, because those women who secretly liked him could all enjoy a bonus to their appearance, becoming beautiful women even if they weren't actually beautiful. In any case, there were also their thin waists, their long and slender legs, their shapely bosoms and so on. As long as one had the heart to discover things, where couldn't one find beautiful scenery? If the juniors didn't understand what he was talking about, then he would beckon them over and help to open their eyes, teaching them a secret mystical ability of the majestic world that couldn't be carelessly taught to other people. After making these jokes and going back to work, he would often lose one or more juniors as the sword cultivators traveled south to collect money. Sometimes, entire groups of sword cultivators would fall in the foreign land. When the survivors gathered again, some faces would be missing, and those who hadn't understood him in the past or had feigned ignorance would never again get the opportunity to say that they understood him. At those times, the self-proclaimed sword practitioner would become more muted and drink by himself. One time he squatted at some place as the sword cultivator slowly returned, but he was ultimately unable to see a single group where he recognized everyone. A great demon appeared in the end, holding a long spear that he raised into the air, as if he were raising a skewer of Tonghulu. The great demon came to a stop extremely far away from the Sword Chi Great Wall, and he explicitly called out the sword cultivator's name before launching the spear at some place on the southern city wall. The sword cultivator caught the spear and gently handed it to a person behind him, after which he dashed forward with his sword, charging to the heart of the savage world and unleashing his blade. He unleashed his blade at Holding Moon Mountain, at Elite Cavalry River, and wherever there was a great demon. Recently, the hint of a smile finally appeared on Sword Immortal Kuxia's bitter face. Lin Junbai had caught 2 wisps of pure sword intent left behind by primordial sword immortals. These wisps of sword intent were extremely high grade, and with Lin Junbai's impressive fated opportunity and skills, what deserved to be his would eventually become his. Even so, obtaining 2 wisps of sword intent instead of a single wisp in such a short amount of time still exceeded Sword Immortal Kuxia's expectations. It most definitely wasn't the case that sword immortals or those with high cultivation bases could forcefully obtain these mystical fated opportunities. A slight moment of carelessness, and one would trigger a violent backlash from a torrent of sword intents. Looking back at history, there were many examples of greedy and pitiful outsider sword immortals becoming surrounded by deadly sword intents, with the danger they faced no less than that of a foolish abode tier cultivator swaggering along the city wall with their abodes completely open. Yen Lu and Jin Jinming also reaped some rewards, with Yen Lu relying more on his luck than skill to obtain a wisp of effeminate sword intent. This was thanks to a strong affinity with his destiny and his great Tao. Meanwhile, it looked like Jin Jinming had relied more on his golden core tier cultivation base to retain that wisp of unrestrained sword intent. As long as Sword Immortal Kuxia didn't become involved in worldly matters and focused only on matters pertaining to the sword, it could be said that his judgment was incredibly sharp. He was Zhou Shenji's junior nephew after all, so he would have been scolded until his sword heart shattered if he didn't possess any outstanding ability. In Sword Immortal Kuxia's eyes, the taciturn Jin Jinming was clearly the type of junior who had lofty visions and grand ambitions, so it was no accident that the pure wisp of sword intent with immense killing intent had coincidentally chosen the mild-tempered young man. In fact, it was thanks to Jin Jinming's strong will that he had won over the sword intent. The violent clash that had taken place inside Jin Jinming's acupoint, where the incoming sword intent had triggered a reaction from the sword chi in his body, had seemingly appeared dangerous and deadly. In reality, however, it had been a basic trial that could eliminate many of the imperfections in Jin Jinming's soul. If he had failed to pass even this trial, then Jin Jinming could have only accepted his fate even if his cultivation base fell as a result. Apart from Sword Immortal Kuxia, the remaining prodigies from the Shaoyuan Empire were all yet to become sword immortals. In fact, many of them would fail to become upper 5-tier sword immortals in the future. Compared to the trivial matters in the city to the north, they were still able to accumulate some minor cultivation benefits even if they weren't able to obtain fated opportunities like Lin Junbai, Yen Lu, and Jin Jinming. This would be no small matter once they returned to the Shaoyuan Empire in the Middle-earth Divine Continent. As they traveled the world outside the mountains, they could easily decide the life and death of people, and they could readily decide the glory or humiliation of entire clans. It was expected for Lin Junbai to obtain a fated opportunity, and it wasn't a big surprise for Yen Lu to obtain one either. However, even Jin Jinming had obtained a huge fated opportunity now, so sword cultivator Jiang Guanqing couldn't help but feel increasingly anxious. Many other prodigies from the Shaoyuan Empire shared the same feelings as him. These talented sword cultivators hadn't felt especially vexed about Lin Junbai obtaining the incredibly huge fated opportunities, but they had felt quite uncomfortable after Yen Lu's success. And now that Jin Jinming, someone who only had a shell of a cultivation base and no actual comprehension ability, had obtained a fated opportunity as well, Jiang Guanqing and the other prodigies could barely stand the situation for much longer. Zhu Mei still couldn't care less. She would look for Yu Zhuanfu, whom she had nicknamed Zaishi, whenever she was free. They would chat casually, and it would almost always be the young girl talking and Yu Zhuanfu listening. Whenever Yu Zhuanfu spoke more in a rare display, that would be to debate with Zhu Mei regarding whether it should be the teacher's tablets or the teacher's documents, and whether it should be the teacher's blades or the teacher's calligraphy brushes. Zhu Mei would purposely argue in bad faith, and she would eventually giggle and concede defeat after debating for a long time. As it turned out, she would view it as a victory if she managed to have Yu Zhuanfu speak more. Sword Immortal Kuxia was in a good mood, so after returning to the Sun residence, he actively visited Sun Jun to drink together in an uncharacteristic display. However, he discovered that Sword Immortal Sun no longer held that immortal wine cup, instead drinking directly from the wine pot. Sun Jiyuan was seemingly unwilling to speak, so sword immortal Kuxia said a few things from the bottom of his heart. I'm just a sword cultivator, and after entering the mountains to cultivate, my life has revolved around practicing the sword. So, there are many matters that I won't deal with, partly because I don't want to, and partly because I'm not able to. Sun Jiyuan glanced at the sincere outsider sword immortal and nodded before replying, I don't have any opinions about you, and even if I do, they're fairly good opinions. Sun Jiyuan was sitting in the corridor as always, and he slapped his knee and continued, cultivators leave behind the noise and travel far away from the mortal world, choosing to reside by themselves. What else can they seek? This is already very good. However, the large sects and immortal forces all become bustling after they achieve success, meaning that it's no longer the case that people are cultivating in seclusion. Kuxia sighed with emotion and remarked, this is the fundamental reason why I'm unwilling to establish my own immortal force, only practicing the sword but not teaching any disciples. I'm afraid that I'll end up with disciples whose sword skills ascend higher and higher, but whose characters plummet lower and lower. I'm bad at speaking reason to begin with, so won't things become even worse at that time? On the other hand, my uncle master is doing very well. His sword skills are lofty enough, so regardless of what the characters of his disciples and grand-disciples are like, they'll still have to obediently mull over my uncle master's thoughts. There's no need for my uncle master to explicitly teach them principles or reason. Sun Jiyuan shook his head and leaned back against the wall, gently swaying his pot of wine as he said, Kuxia, oh Kuxia, you're not even aware of your own uncle master's strength, so I strongly encourage you not to establish an immortal force in your lifetime. You truly don't possess the ability to do so. Sword immortal Kuxia's good mood was immediately ruined by Sun Jiyuan's words, causing his face to become a bitter melon face again. Sun Jiyuan gazed into the distance and said quietly, it would be quite good if the immortals in the mountains of the majestic world were all like you, speaking less but still getting things done. Kuxia extended a hand and said, give me a pot of wine. I also want a drink. Sun Jiyuan flicked his wrist and tossed a pot of wine over. And thus, sword immortal Kuxia's expression became even more bitter. This was because Sun Jiyuan had given him a pot of bamboo sea small world wine. The Sword Chi Great Wall was a place that was very good at playing jokes. Even one's life could be used to play a joke, so what kind of joke wouldn't the sword cultivators dare to play? However, the Sword Chi Great Wall was the Sword Chi Great Wall after all. There wasn't a complicated mess of written rules, but at the same time, there were various unfathomable and unwritten rules. Rules that wouldn't possibly exist anywhere else. If a middle 5-tier sword cultivator didn't like the look of a sword immortal, then they might unleash a torrent of abuse at them, regardless of whether the sword cultivator was drinking wine or not. However, as long as the sword immortal ignored the sword cultivator, then everyone else would ignore them as well. If, on the other hand, the sword immortal responded to the sword cultivator, then the latter could only face the former's wrath. The sword cultivators at the Sword Chi Great Wall wouldn't look up to or look down on the outsiders who came here to practice sword techniques or enjoy the scenery, regardless of who they were disciples of and no matter what clan they hailed from. Everything would be proven with the sword. Those who managed to win face at the Sword Chi Great Wall could be regarded as capable, while those who ended up losing face here could feel free to complain and express their displeasure once they returned home to the majestic world. The latter would do well to never visit the Sword Chi Great Wall again for the rest of their lives, and those related to them would also do well to never approach Stalactite Mountain. There were many sword immortals and sword cultivators who were alone with no family and friends before they fell on the battlefield, and if they didn't leave behind a will, then all of their possessions would become ownerless. If these cultivators left behind a will, on the other hand, then their possessions would be distributed according to their wishes. This was the case regardless of how many immortal coins they owned, and even if they were a sword immortal with an extremely valuable sword. Moreover, people wouldn't fight for these inheritances even if the recipient were a lower 5-tier sword cultivator. Of course, people didn't dare to fight for these inheritances on the surface, and they shouldn't treat the hidden official and her subordinates as blind if they dared to make any moves in secret. Many clans had learned this lesson the hard way, almost managing to relocate to Taixiang Street or Ritual Baton Street before suffering severe damage due to their lowly actions. The rules were very simple. Those who weren't educated properly and dared to snatch the inheritances would be punished by death. At the same time, the most powerful member of their clan would be beaten half-dead by Luoshan or Zhuan, and if these two weren't strong enough, then the hidden official would be very happy to assist. Their life would be spared, seeing that they still needed to participate in the large-scale battles and slay more demons. However, they needed to be the last to retreat, and the punishment would be considered served if they managed to return alive. Of course, they didn't need to dream about receiving any funds or settlements from the sword market, the garment market, and the alchemical pill market. This was a place where even sword immortals wouldn't have proper burial grounds, so how could there possibly be door gods, couplets, and celebrations during the new year? This was simply impossible. After hundreds, thousands, and then tens of thousands of years, all of the sword cultivators were now accustomed to the thatched cottage on the Great Wall. They were accustomed to the old great sword immortal who almost never left the city wall. It was as if the lunar almanac didn't exist if the old great sword immortal didn't flip through it. More accurately, it was almost as if the lunar almanac had never existed in the first place. Noble scholar Wang Zhai of the etiquette sage's lineage visited the wine shop today, purchasing wine here for the first time. However, the noisy sword cultivators and customers appeared quite unwelcoming to the noble scholar. One reason was his status as a reputable scholar in the majestic world, and another reason was the rumor that Wang Zhai had too much spare time, always targeting the second shopkeeper for him killing the young man with a single punch that time, and insisting on giving him moral lectures. In fact, he was putting in even more effort than the inspection sword immortals belonging to the hidden official's lineage. The sword cultivators found this very strange. So be it if disciples of the second sage and the scholarly sage were fighting violently with each other. But why was the lineage of the etiquette sage getting involved? Were they kicking the disciples of the scholarly sage while they were down? Wang Zhai was unfazed as he purchased some wine and took his leave. He didn't eat a bowl of yangchan noodles or a plate of pickled vegetables, nor did he squat on the side of the street to drink like those sword cultivators. Wang Zhai smiled in his mind, thinking that the second shopkeeper truly should have treated him to this pot of wine. Wang Zhai didn't return the same way that he had come, instead choosing to make his way to the secluded alley corner with his pot of wine. There should have been a young man in azure sitting on a small stool here, and Wang Zhai stopped and said with a small chuckle, when knowledgeable noble scholars compose texts or establish theories, being fair and just is the most important, and being meticulous and detailed would be even better. Wang Zhai recalled something before leaving the Sword Qi Great Wall, and he made his way back to the wine shop and found a blank safety tablet, writing down his name on the front side and a statement on the back side reading, "Treat others with lenience, treat oneself with strictness, persuade others with reason, restrain oneself with morality. This will bring peace to the world and offer people true safety." After writing this, Wang Zhai hung up the safety tablet and had a look at the contents on the neighboring safety tablets. He didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. There was a safety tablet that might very well be gilded in gold in the future, and the sword immortal from the Golden Armor continent had written sincerely, "The second shopkeeper never tricks his customers, he's the impressive drinker called Chen Pingan." This was clearly a sword immortal who didn't plan on leaving the Sword Qi Great Wall anytime soon. There was also another safety tablet, which the second shopkeeper would most definitely praise as reflecting the good conscience of a kind person. The comment on this safety tablet read, "The scholarly lineage possesses deep knowledge and even more impressive shamelessness. I'll treat second shopkeeper to truly good wine when you visit the Flowing Dawn continent in the future." This was clearly written by someone who was planning to leave the Sword Qi Great Wall and go to Stalactite Mountain, much like Wang Zhai. If he saw this comment, he would remark, "Such a good person is only a nascent tier sword cultivator? This can't be right. The unpolished jade tier would be too low, and the immortal tier won't be too high," Wang Zhai murmured to himself. He then smiled faintly and continued, however, "These words are only amusing and welcome when they come from the mouth of the second shopkeeper. If I spoke those words, that would be akin to a wrinkly old lady applying thick makeup to her face. Quite pointless and repulsive. Not all of the outsiders could integrate with the Sword Qi Great Wall like Chen Pingan and be viewed as family by the local sword cultivators." Wang Zhai felt slightly happy for Chen Pingan, but he also felt slightly sad at the same time. He hesitated for a moment before adding another line of tiny characters on his safety tablet, writing, "It's up to each person to act with virtue, and I strive to act virtuously so." Virtue is at hand. Here's wishing that those with such a mindset can be free from trouble and worry. Wang Zhai noticed a young boy who had come here to collect wine standing nearby. His name was Jiang Chu, and he was from Raincoat Alley. Wang Zhai turned around and said to the young boy with a smile, "Tell the second shopkeeper that the wine tastes okay. He can strive to sell more and make money in a proper and justified manner." Jiang Chu smiled bashfully and nodded earnestly in response. Wang Zhai downed the contents of the wine pot in a single gulp before casually placing the empty wine pot on the counter. He laughed heartily and strode out of the wine shop, cupping his fists at the numerous sword cultivators sitting at the tables and squatting on the side of the street and saying, "Who dares to buy my sword or wine? But 10,000 cups can be drunk free of charge." He was met with silence, and this was completely within his expectations. He laughed loudly and continued, "Then let me offer something more direct. Here's hoping that when the present sword immortals come here to drink in the future, an entire sea of wine can be consumed. Yet the shopkeeper won't accept a single immortal coin." No one accepted these well wishes. Someone snickered and said, "Esteemed noble scholar, you haven't poisoned the wine, have you? No matter how poor second shopkeeper's character is, he won't stoop as low as to do something like this. You're a noble scholar, so you shouldn't frame second shopkeeper like this." Wang Zhai didn't say anything in retort, and he smiled in response as he walked away. After walking far away, he raised a hand high into the air and gave a thumbs up, saying, "It's my great pleasure to be acquainted with so many sword immortals." Spirited discussions immediately swept through the wine shop. Was he possessed by second shopkeeper? Or was he the second shopkeeper in disguise? This kind of tactic is taking things too far. Way too far. Second shopkeeper is far too impressive, even able to influence a noble scholar from the etiquette lineage and transform him into a friend? He can be regarded as a scholar who still has some conscience left. Noble scholar Wang Zhai left the wine shop and walked through the small alleys, retrieving a simple seal that appeared as white as jade. This was a seal that Chen Pingan had privately given him, containing not only characters on the side but even the date it was made. The characters on the side read, "The road muddy and the people weary. The heroes who slay criminals aren't recorded in the books. True scholars are not frivolous. Their deeds like towering boulders that soar into the sky." The seal script characters read, "So you're a noble scholar." Die. Pei Qian finally came to her senses. She came to a belated realization, so she wanted to practice more fist techniques to make up for all the time she had wasted. She soaked in the medicinal baths again and again, after which she would lie in bed to recuperate. Once she recovered, she would visit Grandma Bai to continue practicing fist techniques. Grandma Bai was unwilling to go too hard on the Ning resident's future son-in-law, but she was very happy to go hard on this young girl. It wasn't that Grandma Bai didn't like Pei Qian, but quite the contrary. Pei Qian was Grandma Bai's favorite among Chen Pingan's several disciples. The young girl appeared cowardly on the surface, but she actually possessed the strongest determination and grit in her eyes. No longer grounded at home, Guizhuzhou often visited the Ning residence to wander around. She would go to the training ground to watch Pei Qian get beaten down from the beginning to the end, and when Pei Qian was finally unable to pick herself back up, Guizhuzhou would sprint over to gently carry the wounded Pei Qian on her back. When Guizhuzhou was occasionally bored and with nothing better to do, she would also ask Mr. Zhong about fist techniques. When Pei Qian woke up today, she saw that Guizhuzhou was already sitting on the door threshold. The young girl accompanied her senior sister and chatted with her, helping her relieve boredom and pass time. As for whether senior sister Pei Qian actually wanted to chat with her, Guizhuzhou didn't care about this at all. After all, her senior sister was definitely willing to chat with her. When they became tired from chatting, Guizhuzhou would hold up her lush green inkstone and exhale onto it, showing it off to her senior sister. Bai Shou walked past the Ning residence again today, and even though the gates were open, did he dare to challenge that person's temper? He briskly walked away. Noticing this, Guizhuzhou lowered her voice and asked, "Senior sister Shorty, do you feel that Bai Shou likes you?" It was as if Pei Qian had been struck by a bolt of lightning as she exclaimed, "What? You didn't notice?" Guizhuzhou asked in astonishment. "If I go and ask Bai Shou, do you believe me when I say that he'll definitely deny that he likes you? However, you've definitely heard of this saying before." The words of men are like ghosts that claim to sunbathe in the morning. Pei Qian no longer had the time and effort to focus on Guozhujiu's additional remarks, and it seemed like Bai Shou would suffer the same fate no matter if he accepted or denied the accusation made by Guozhujiu. Pei Qian slammed her fist into the bed and exclaimed, "How infuriating!" Guozhujiu lowered her head and scrubbed her inkstone, sighing again and again as she lamented. I also know another common saying that goes, "A married lady is like spilled water." That being the case, senior sister will belong to the Great Emblem Sword sect in the future, and your seat in the ancestral hall in Master's hometown will become empty. If that's the case, then won't we lack a leader apart from Master? How worrisome. Don't you dare dream about usurping my position. Pei Qian shouted in anger. There's a piece of paper with my name stuck on that chair, and no one else is allowed to sit on it apart from Master. Then we'll talk about this later. There's no hurry, Guozhujiu said with a nod. Why doesn't Bai Shou like you instead? Pei Qian suddenly asked. Guozhujiu looked up and replied with a serious expression. He's not blind, so why would he be attracted to me instead of my amazing senior sister? Pei Qian crossed her arms and replied with a chuckle, that's hard to say. Guozhujiu smiled broadly and said, I was only kidding just then, senior sister. Whoever believed me will trip and fall when they walk. Pei Qian pursed her lips. She then asked Guozhujiu, when are you going to visit Downtrodden Mountain to play with me? Guozhujiu appeared slightly listless as she replied, my words don't count, and I can't do anything about my parents being so strict. Pei Qian fell silent for a moment, before smiling and saying their words might sound unpleasant, but their intentions are good, so you have to listen to them even if you don't want to. In any case, your parents and elders won't scold you too much even if they go all out. They can't bring themselves to do so. Guozhujiu thought for a moment before nodding and saying okay. After falling silent for a moment, Guozhujiu glanced at the hiking pole that was resting on the table. Seizing the opportunity while her senior sister was sound asleep before, she had grabbed the hiking pole and scrubbed it clean, using her spit, her sleeves, and even her cheeks in the end. She had truly been as sincere as could be. Senior sister, can I borrow your bamboo bookcase to carry for a while? She asked. Why? Give me a good reason, Pei Qian replied. Because it looks good to carry. Don't you think before you speak, senior sister? Your brain is quite sharp, so why isn't it working now? Pei Qian felt like it was extremely tiring to talk with Guozhujiu. Senior sister, is stinky tofu truly that delicious? It's incredibly fragrant. Will your farts also become fragrant after you eat stinky tofu? Don't you find yourself annoying, Guozhujiu? And thus, Pei Qian was treated to the sight of the young girl sitting on the door threshold and continuing to soundlessly move her mouth. Guozhujiu continued to amuse herself in this manner even after Pei Qian purposely looked away, and she became even more spirited after Pei Qian accidentally stole a glance. Alright, you can speak again. Being annoyed by you is better than suffering a big headache, Pei Qian said in exasperation. If I'm unable to speak with senior sister one day, then you need to feel annoyed whenever you think of me. The more I annoy senior sister now, the more you'll remember me in the future, Guozhujiu suddenly said. Pei Qian was dazed and speechless as she looked at the smiling young girl. A young man in azure sat down on the door threshold, and he waved a hand and gestured for Pei Qian to remain lying down in bed. Chen Pingan sat beside Guozhujiu and said with a smile, You're still young, so you're not allowed to say these things. Even Master isn't saying these things, so how can my disciples say these things? Guozhujiu no longer wandered aimlessly through the streets by herself when she returned home this time, and she no longer acted like a small, stray cat on the walls of the neighboring residences on Ritual Baton Street. She was extremely well behaved because her master was walking beside her. A young boy whom she was well acquainted with leaned over a wall and asked with a smile, Why aren't you visiting the checkpoints and challenging the generals today, Lu Duan? I've achieved great mastery with my sword techniques over the past 2 days, so I'll definitely be able to fight off your challenge. I'll definitely force you to obediently take a detour. Guozhujiu looked up and asked with a blank expression, And who were you again? The young boy hurriedly disappeared from view after seeing Guozhujiu secretly signal to him with her eyes. This was also Chen Pingan's first time visiting Ritual Baton Street's Guo clan, and Sword Immortal Guojia personally walked out to welcome him. However, Chen Pingan only dropped Guozhujiu off at the door, politely turning down Guojia's invitation to enter the Guo residence. Sword Immortal Luoshan from the hidden official's lineage was still keeping a close eye on him, After all, and even though the Ning residents didn't care about these matters, Chen Pingan still needed to consider the implications for Sword Immortal Guojia and the Gua clan. At the very least, he needed to make an effort to show that he cared. Guojia dragged his daughter inside and casually asked, "What did you and your senior sister Shorty chat about over there?" "Dad, I won't tell you anything even if you interrogate me," Guojia replied. "Just who am I? I'm Guojia, Great Sword Immortal Guojia's daughter. I won't utter a single word about these matters that I shouldn't talk about." Guojia looked down at his smiling daughter and gently smacked her head, saying, "No wonder they all say that grown daughters are hard to keep at home. Dad is absolutely heartbroken. But Mom isn't the same. Even though she married Dad, she still defends her family all the time, doesn't she?" Guojia asked. "And also, I have to say this, Dad, but you never grumble to your master or drink with your Sword Immortal friends when you feel wronged by Mom, and you instead run to your father-in-law's place to play the pitiful victim. This annoys Mom to death. You might not know this yet, but Grandpa has secretly chatted with me before, asking me to persuade you against running over to look for him all the time. Grandpa says that he's begging you, his son-in-law, to take pity on him. Otherwise, he'll ultimately be the one to suffer the most." Guojia was very accustomed to his daughter's incisive remarks, so this naturally gave him some form of immunity. With this in mind, his father-in-law would also do well to grow accustomed and develop some immunity. There was no need for Guojia to be too polite with his own family. The dark shadow in Guojia's heart dispersed a little as if illuminated by moonlight. Zuoyu had visited him earlier, and it was a positive conversation where Zuoyu had spoken reason instead of drawing his sword. In this sense, Guojia was much more fortunate than Great Sword Immortal Yu Qing. Of course, Zuoyu had still carried a sword with him even though he hadn't drawn his blade. In reality, Guojia actually felt deep gratitude for this sword-carrying visitor, who possessed the loftiest sword skills in the world, from the bottom of his heart. Similarly, Guojia also had a very good impression of the young man who had accompanied his daughter back home just then. It appeared that disciples of the scholarly lineage were all very good at speaking a type of wordless reason. Moreover, they were speaking these reasons to both the Gua clan and those outside the Gua clan. Guojia had always hoped that his daughter Lu Duan could visit Stalactite Mountain to take a look, taking a leaf from Ningyao's book and traveling further to see more things. It wouldn't matter if she returned home later. However, despite his daughter enjoying the hustle and bustle from a young age, she surprisingly hadn't ever thought about secretly sneaking off to Stalactite Mountain. Guojia had asked his wife to provide strong hints to Guojia before, but their daughter had reeled off a reason that had rendered them completely speechless. Guojia said that when she was little, she had spent a huge amount of effort to climb onto the roof of their house. Upon seeing the moon resting atop the parapet of the Sword Qi Great Wall, she had thought to herself that she would definitely run over to touch the moon one day. When she grew up and went to the city wall by herself, however, she discovered that things were completely different from her imagination. The moon was extremely far away from the city wall, so far away that she couldn't touch it at all. Thus, she was no longer willing to travel far away. The city wall of the Sword Qi Great Wall was already so tall, yet she was still unable to touch the moon even when she reached up and jumped as high as she could. That being the case, it would only become harder to touch the moon if she traveled to Stalactite Mountain. That would be very uninteresting. The reason for Zuoyu's visit was that he hoped Guojia could become an official disciple of his junior brother, Chen Pingan. If Guojia agreed, then it was naturally implied that Guojia would need to follow her senior brothers and senior sisters to the ancestral hall in the eastern treasured Vile Continent's Downtrodden Mountain to pay respects to her grandmaster. Afterward, she could either stay at Downtrodden Mountain or choose to travel elsewhere. If the young girl truly missed home, then she could also return to the Sword Qi Great Wall at a later date. Guojia felt like this was okay. Zuoyu, personally visiting with his sword at his waist, had proposed this, so the unpolished jade tier Guojia hadn't dared to disagree. The other sword immortals hadn't found any reason to disagree either, and if they managed to find one, they could complain to Zuoyu themselves. However, Guojia suddenly said, "Dad, while coming home, Master asked me if I wanted to travel to his hometown in the majestic world with senior sister Shorty and the others, and I risked death to go against Master's wishes, turning down this request. Say, aren't I very brave and heroic?" Guojia sighed in his mind and asked with a smile, "Why didn't you agree?" There are many rules pertaining to becoming a disciple in the majestic world, much more than what exists in the Sword Chi Great Wall. It's not the case that you can become a disciple simply with a nod from your Tao mentor, not even needing to kowtow and only needing to casually give a toast in respect. You also need to go to the ancestral hall to pay respects to the portraits hanging there, offer incense, and go through many other complicated etiquette. You'll need to abide by the customs of the majestic world if you truly want to become Chen Pingan's official disciple. Guozhuzhou shook her head and replied, I'll go with Master whenever he returns to his hometown. Otherwise, who will look after Dad's garden if I leave? Guojia tried his best to maintain a straight face as he said in an earnest voice, Tone it down with your sword technique the next time you attack the flies and insects. Don't hack the plants and flowers as well. It's a shame that senior sister wasn't willing to give me her hiking pole, Guozhuzhou lamented in disappointment. Otherwise, to say nothing of Dad's garden, even the entire Guo residence would be free from flies. Dad could hold me accountable and smack my head if even a single fly managed to sneak in. Guojia walked to the garden after parting ways with his daughter. Guozhuzhou frequently visited the Ning residence after becoming Chen Pingan's disciple, so she no longer had the time and effort to meticulously take care of the plants and flowers in the garden. This allowed the plants and flowers to grow spectacularly well. Guojia stood by himself in a pavilion that was decorated with a blooming splendor of flowers, but he couldn't bring himself to feel happy even as he looked at the neat and flourishing garden. How could humans enjoy longevity if the flowers were beautiful, the moon was full, and everything was perfect? Thus, Guojia would rather that the garden was damaged, but the people were together. Over at the Ning residence, Ning Yao was still cultivating in seclusion. Meanwhile, Pei Qian was practicing fist techniques with Grandma Bai. Zhong Qiu was practicing walking meditation, using the abundant sword intent suffusing through heaven and earth to temper his fist intent. Chao Qinglang was cultivating, and Cui Dongshan was drinking with brother Nalan. Chen Pingan made his way to the expanding wine shop after leaving the Guo residence on Ritual Baton Street, and following the well-established rules, he didn't fight for a table with the customers, seeing that he was the shopkeeper. He squatted on the side of the street to drink, but it was a shame that Fandach was very unkind, having directly used all of the remaining funds of his lesser heat coin to drink in a single sitting. As a result, Chen Pingan had no option but to pay for his wine. Zhang Chu was manning the counter, and the young boy mustered his courage and said that he had made a prepayment to Big Sister with his wage not long ago, so he could treat Mr. Chen to a pot of Bamboo Sea Small World wine. Chen Pingan didn't accept this offer, saying it wasn't that he didn't want to, but rather that he didn't dare, lest his extremely good reputation at the Sword Chi Great Wall be blemished. He was a scholar, so he naturally needed to look after his image. Zhang Chu continued to serve the customers, thinking to himself that Mr. Chen was a scholar who very much didn't look after his image. This wouldn't do. Chen Pingan leisurely enjoyed some wine before getting 2 extra bowls of free wine from the fellow drinkers around him. Only then did he stand up and walk to the 2 new walls of the wine shop, going over the names and contents of all the safety tablets. He then grabbed a small stool and made his way to the corner of the alley, earnestly waving his verdant green bamboo stick around and calling for attention like those storytellers who stood under overpasses in the mortal markets. Feng was the first to run over, and he was in such a rush that he hadn't even grabbed his ceramic pot, which was growing heavier and heavier by the week. The little boy whispered into the second shopkeeper's ears, roughly explaining his predicament and telling Chen Pingan to be careful with what he said. Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response, and in exchange he told Feng to run through the streets and alleys to gather a bigger audience for him. After receiving a promise from the second shopkeeper that his lies wouldn't be exposed, Feng firmly patted Chen Pingan's shoulder and raised a thumb, saying that his brother was truly loyal and had his back. Chen Pingan glanced at Feng, and the little boy immediately patted the second shopkeeper's shoulder lightly again, after which he shouted at the top of his lungs as he ran down the streets and alleys, announcing that the storyteller was finally going to continue telling the story about the scholar beating the drums outside the city god pavilion to complain about injustice. After a crowd formed around him, Chen Pingan grabbed some roasted seeds from the little girl beside him before continuing to tell the story about the mountain god bullying men and seizing beautiful women. In the end, the scholar would eventually overcome many obstacles to finally reunite with his lover. However, the children became unhappy and started to noisily complain after Chen Pingan talked about the city god feeling timid and thinking about retreating after hearing the scholar's complaint about the haughty and powerful mountain god. What the hell was this all about? Chen Pingan had spent an excessive amount of time introducing the various officials in the city god pavilion, such as the day and night wandering deities, the scholarly and martial officials, the generals, and so on, describing what virtues they had performed when alive and why they were able to become officials in the city god pavilion after death. Not only that, but Chen Pingan also detailed the phrases written on the plaques, why the official garb of the city god was so mighty and imposing, and a whole trove of other useless information. In the end, however, the city god, who was described as having countless ghost subordinates and a powerful army, was actually unwilling to provide justice to the pitiful scholar? This was the outcome after laying so many foundations? Chen Pingan finished the roasted seeds in his hand and was just about to turn around to ask the little girl for some more. To his surprise, the little girl actually turned around and refused to give him more roasted seeds. Feng no longer cared about whether Chen Pingan would snitch on him and reveal that he hadn't dared to knock on the door of the Ning residence at all, as he rewarded the second shopkeeper with a punch, exclaiming in rage, "No, this won't do at all. Either you directly tell us the ending, or you might as well start a new and more satisfying story. Otherwise, I won't come here again in the future. You can sit here by yourself and enjoy the loneliness." The other children nodded in agreement. Sure enough, those sword immortals drinking wine had very sharp eyes and good judgment. The second shopkeeper truly had a black heart. So be it if they didn't listen to such a frustrating and depressing story. Chen Pingan raised the bamboo stick in his hand and put together the index finger and middle finger of his other hand, waving his two fingers around as if he were brandishing a sword before asking, "I already mentioned the city god temple last time, so does anyone remember the couplet outside the door, the one which I only described half of?" A young boy nodded and replied, "Yes, that half of the couplet read, I pray to be guided by my conscience, becoming a person who does good deeds. Heaven and earth are vast during the day, I act with propriety and feel at peace. I lie in bed at night, my soul calm and my dreams stable." Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response. "I asked you last time why you didn't reveal the other half of the couplet, and you simply replied that it was a secret that couldn't be revealed. But you can tell us now, right?" the young boy asked. "Don't fret, and allow me to build some more suspense as I tell the story that's far from over," Chen Pingan replied. It was completely silent in the city god temple, and the city god stroked his beard and didn't dare to speak. The scholarly judge, the martial judge, and the day and night wandering deity were also speechless. Right at the moment, dark clouds suddenly covered the moon. The commoners were too poor to light candles, and the moonlight was now blocked, so the scholar looked around and felt utter despair. He felt like the entire world was collapsing, and he was destined to never save the young woman whom he loved. Staying alive like this was even more torturous than death, so he thought to himself that he might as well bang his head against a wall and commit suicide. He was unwilling to take another glance at the filth of the world. Feng and the other children felt extremely anxious upon hearing this. Just what in the world was going on at the majestic world? More and more people were gathering around to listen to Chen Pingan's stories now. Yet the second shopkeeper was only good at embarrassing him. Feng. How could he still make a name for himself in the cultivation world in the future? This was something that the second shopkeeper had told him about. The cultivation world could actually be divided into bigger cultivation worlds and smaller cultivation worlds, and he needed to practice his abilities in the small cultivation world around himself before he could enter the larger cultivation world. Chen Pingan smacked his knee and continued, "It was at this critical moment, when the scholar's life was hanging by a thread, that a speck of light unexpectedly appeared outside the forebodingly dark city god temple. This was an extremely small speck of light, yet the city god suddenly looked up and laughed heartily, announcing in a loud voice, 'My friends have come. This matter shall not be difficult to resolve.' The beaming city god walked around his study desk and strode down the stairs of the platform, walking out to welcome his friends. He quietly said something when he brushed past the scholar, and the scholar wasn't sure whether he should believe the city god or not. Even so, he still followed the city god out of the main hall. My dear listeners, do you know who arrived? Could it be that wicked mountain god barging over to demand an explanation from the scholar? Or perhaps it was someone else arriving to help in a timely manner. giving the scholar a ray of hope in his darkest hour? If you want to find out, then please come again. The little girl beside Chen Pingan suddenly extended a hand and offered the storyteller a pile of roasted seeds, saying, "Don't tell us to come again next time. Why don't you continue the story now?" "Yes, continue the story now. I still have a lot of roasted seeds left." The young boy who asked about the other half of the couplet was extremely irritated as he huffed, "Don't beg him. He can do whatever he wants. In any case, I'm never going to come back after listening to the rest of this story." Chen Pingan accepted the roasted seeds from the little girl's hand before vigorously waving his bamboo stick and continuing, "Looking closely, that tiny speck of light suddenly grew larger and larger. Not only that, but more specks of light started to appear as well, gathering together and appearing like a new moon. These specks of light sliced through the night sky, blasting through the dark sea of clouds and appearing like towering immortals who were even taller than the 5 mountains. Across the vast lands, the beasts, cultivators, and commoners were all startled awake from their dreams. Walking outside and looking up, it was truly a sight to behold. The storyteller hurriedly started to snack on the sunflower seeds after reaching this riveting point in the story, and he said, "Please don't rush me. Allow me to eat a few roasted seeds first." After finishing his snack, Chen Pingan continued, "The closer the specks of light got to the city god temple, the more thunderous the booming sound in the scholar's ears, almost as if a deity were relentlessly beating a drum above his head. The scholar was worried about the city god being in cahoots with the mountain god. But there was also a glimmer of hope in his heart, a wish that there would eventually be someone willing to seek justice for him in this vast heaven and earth. Even if this failed, just making an attempt would leave him feeling satisfied. The roads of life ultimately weren't full of treachery. The righteous heart of another person could indeed bring him comfort." The children crowded around the small stool held their breaths and listened intently with their ears pricked up. The scholar couldn't help but raise a hand and block his eyes, with the brilliant specks of light becoming increasingly blinding as they drew closer and closer. In the end, the mortal scholar was forced to close his eyes, unable to even peer at the approaching light. To say nothing of the scholar, even the city god and his subordinates were forced to avert their gazes, unable to look directly at the blazing light between heaven and earth. Guess how brilliant the light became? With the city god temple as the center, the blinding radiance illuminated an area measuring 50 kilometers in radius, appearing much like the bright sun in the morning sky. How could the measly mountain god possibly enjoy such power and imposing might? Perhaps it was a passing sword immortal? Feng asked in an uncertain voice. The little girl who was sitting on the other side of the small stool nodded vigorously and concurred. "Definitely. Mr. Chen said before that those sword immortals all have pure hearts, with their swords exuding brilliant radiance. Indeed, they were none other than sword immortals who had left the mountains to travel around the world," Chen Pingan revealed. However, this definitely wasn't all. A young sword immortal wearing a billowing white robe led the group and was the first to arrive at the city god temple atop his sword, and he retracted his flying sword and gracefully landed on the ground. And what a coincidence! This person's name was Feng, a young sword immortal who was quickly gaining renown in the world. He loved to act righteously and uphold justice, and as he traveled around the martial world, the small ceramic pot by his waist would clink and clank. However, it was unknown what was kept inside this vessel. Even more coincidentally, the beautiful female sword immortal beside him was surprisingly called Shu Exine. Every time she stood on her flying sword and left the mountains, she would like to keep some roasted seeds in her sleeves. As it turned out, she would only eat some roasted seeds after she resolved a matter and upheld justice in the martial world. If people were extremely grateful and wanted to thank her, then the female sword immortal wouldn't ask for money, and she would instead be happy to receive some roasted seeds. Feng was dumbstruck, and when he returned to his senses, he hurriedly sat up straight, with tears almost bursting from his eyes. The little boy was extremely moved as he exclaimed, "This story is truly exhilarating." The little girl called Shu Exine felt slightly embarrassed, flushing bright red and even feeling a sense of guilt. By the looks of it, she had brought too few roasted seeds today. Chen Pingan continued to tell the story saying whoosh whoosh whoosh. Numerous sword immortals landed on the ground, one after another, with each appearing graceful and carefree. The men were either extremely handsome or astonishingly imposing. while the women were stunningly beautiful or attractively gallant. The city god, who knew what to expect but clearly still didn't know well enough, was given a fright, while his subordinate officials and subjects were further stunned by what they saw. They bowed in respect, feeling absolutely shocked and not daring to look up at the new arrivals. Why had so many sword immortals suddenly appeared at once? Among those extremely famous sword immortals, there was not only Feng and Shu Xian, but there was also Zhou Shuiting, Zhao Yuzhen, Ma Xiang'er. Chen Pingan reeled off a long list of names, and while doing so, he looked toward a child whose name he didn't know. Upon seeing this, the child hurriedly shouted, "My name is Shi Tan." And thus, the storyteller added Shi Tan to the list of sword immortals. The young boy called Zhao Yuzhen cracked a grin when he heard his name, but he quickly wiped the smile from his face and put on a stern expression. If the next story told by Chen Pingan still had sword immortal Zhao Yuzhen, then it wouldn't hurt for him to come over and listen in. Otherwise, he would stick to his protest and refuse to listen. But how would he know whether sword immortal Zhao Yuzhen, who shared the same name as him, would appear in the next story? The young boy from the impoverished alley would naturally need to come here first to hear the next story. The story remained full of twists and turns afterward, but the children continued to pick and choose their favorite bits to focus on. In the end, none of the children left, whether they were near the small stool or standing further away. They listened to the entire story, which concluded with the scholar marrying his lover, and all of the sword immortals visiting to offer their congratulations. After experiencing many hardships and overcoming many difficulties, the scholar and his lover were finally able to become husband and wife, living happily ever after. The children would usually disperse after the storytelling session concluded, but this time, they surprisingly didn't leave straight away. This was a very rare occasion. This time, however, Chen Pingan didn't say anything unrelated to the stories. He simply looked at the children and said with a smile, "Stories don't just exist in books, and each of you has your own stories. Not only that, but your stories will only grow as time goes on. I won't come here to tell stories anymore in the future, and if the opportunity arises, I hope that some of you can take over the role. I'll come here to listen to your stories." Chen Pingan grabbed the small stool and stood up. "Are you returning to your hometown, Mr. Chen?" a child asked in a timid voice. Chen Pingan shook his head and replied with a smile, "No, I'm going to stay here. However, I'm not just a storyteller who tells stories and tricks people, nor am I just a bookkeeper who sells wine and earns money. I have many other things to deal with." Chen Pingan walked away, and after walking for a while he suddenly turned around and said with a chuckle, "If you want to know what happens next?" Many of the children who had already stood up and started to leave burst into laughter, and only a smattering of children completed the phrase. However, their voices weren't small as they said, "Then do come again next time." Chen Pingan smiled and murmured to himself, "I'll save this, yes, I'll temporarily save this for later." Pei Qian diligently practiced fist techniques as she had in Downtrodden Mountain's bamboo building back then. She was afraid of her master suddenly shooing her away one day. Downtrodden Mountain was very good, but it wouldn't be good enough without her master around. Grandma Bai was a bit unwilling to go hard during the training session today, and she presumably hadn't eaten enough rice. However, Pei Qian thought this was okay because she felt like she was on the verge of overcoming the barrier of the 4th tier. This caused Pei Qian to feel extremely happy, with a wide smile on her face as she talked quite a lot with Grandma Bai. Pei Qian felt like she finally had a good excuse to stay at the Sword Qi Great Wall for longer. Unexpectedly, however, her master and Cui Dongshan walked down from the pavilion atop the dragon-slaying platform before she even had the time to run over and tell her master the good news. They walked to the training ground, and Chen Pingan said that she could pack up and return home straight away. Pei Qian looked at the big white goose, who could only shake his head in helplessness. Master had already made up his mind, so this junior brother was unable to persuade Master otherwise. Pei Qian didn't cry or shout or cause a ruckus, not daring to do so and not willing to either. She quietly accompanied her master, and she returned to her residence and packed up her belongings, carrying the small bookcase on her back and holding the hiking pole in her hand. It was winter, so why was the sun shining so bright? Wouldn't a large downpour be nice? That way, she could leave the Ning residence a bit later. It would be fine even if she stood at the entrance to seek shelter for a while. Chao Qinglang also appeared at the entrance with Mr. Zhong. with the former holding a hiking pole and carrying his luggage sack diagonally across his body. Chen Pingan left the Ning residence with them, walking on foot as he accompanied them to the large gate guarded by the elderly Taoist nun from the Taoist saber room, as well as the old sword immortal. However, Cui Dongshan left halfway, going elsewhere and saying that they could meet up at Stalactite Mountain's Stork Inn. Chen Pingan stopped at the large gate and said, "I'll see you off here. Take care." Pei Qian stood there with her head lowered. Chao Qinglang gifted his master a seal, which Chen Pingan accepted with a smile. Pei Qian looked up and said in a quiet voice, "Master, I left some things on Big Sister Ning's desk. Remember to tell her when she exits seclusion." Chen Pingan nodded and replied, "I'll definitely remember. When you return to Downtrodden Mountain, don't just focus on your own glorious deeds and other nonsense when you tell Nuanshu and Meili about the Sword Qi Great Wall, and make sure to give them a proper recount of what this place is like." The rims of Pei Qian's eyes were red as she nodded and said, "I'll listen to Master's instructions." This was very strange. In the past, it had always been her staying put and her master embarking on distant journeys, but this time it was her master staying put and bidding her farewell as she embarked on the long journey home. This made her feel even sadder. This being the case, should she still leave Downtrodden Mountain to travel around the martial world by herself in the future? Master would appear quite pitiful if he were left alone at Downtrodden Mountain. Chen Pingan looked back, only to see a young girl sprinting over. Pei Qian finally felt a little happier, thinking that her junior sister would have suffered a massive loss if she had actually dared not come over. Guozhujiu suddenly ground to a halt before jumping forward and landing beside Pei Qian. There was a beaming smile on her face as she exclaimed, "Senior Sister Shorty is about to part ways with Master. Cry. Hurry up and cry. You'll feel better after you cry, especially since I'll still be here to look after Master." Even if Pei Qian had wanted to cry, she would definitely be unable to cry now. She took off her small bookcase, which was actually empty, and handed it to Guozhujiu, saying, "Let me make this clear first. Your senior sister is only lending this bamboo bookcase to you, not giving it to you. Don't try to give me a damaged bookcase the next time we meet, and it's best that it doesn't even get a single scratch. I won't lend it to you if you don't agree." Guozhujiu accepted the small bookcase and immediately wore it on her back, nodding earnestly as she replied, "You can feel completely at ease, senior sister. The small bookcase looks better on my back, and if it could speak and express itself, it would definitely be smiling widely at this moment, so wide that it wouldn't even be able to say a single word. It would be basking in joy." Pei Qian extended a hand and instructed, "Give the bookcase back." Guozhujiu sidestepped this command and instead proposed, "Senior sister, why don't you lend me your hiking pole as well? The small bookcase and the hiking pole make a perfect pair, and I'll definitely wear the bookcase and carry the hiking pole every single day." Thud thud thud. I'll drive the hiking pole into the bluestone slabs and dirt roads of the streets and alleys, only stopping after I've traversed all of them. There was an aggrieved expression on Pei Qian's face. She was lending her small bamboo bookcase to her junior sister already, yet Guozhujiu was trying to take a mile after being given an inch. Was this how a junior sister should act? Thus, Pei Qian immediately turned around to look at her master. Chen Pingan smiled and said, "The next time you meet Guozhujiu, you can take the small bookcase back before lending her the hiking pole." Pei Qian raised an eyebrow at Guozhujiu. "Okay then," Guozhujiu said with a nod. She then dragged Pei Qian aside, with the two young girls starting to quietly chat with each other. Guozhujiu gave Pei Qian a small wooden container, saying that this was a present for her senior sister for paying homage to the mountains. Pei Qian didn't dare to carelessly accept this present, so she turned her head to look at her master again. Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response. "Mr. Zhong, there's no hurry to return to the Eastern Treasured Vial continent after you arrive in the Majestic World, and you can take them with you and travel around the Southern World continent first. I have a friend called Lu Xianying who's currently studying at the Pure Confucian Chang clan," Chen Pingan said to Zhong Qiu. "However, Cui Dongshan most likely won't accompany you and the others, as there are many things he needs to attend to at home. So remember to borrow more immortal coins from him when you arrive at Stalactite Mountain. There are many beautiful and enjoyable things when traveling, and just enjoying the scenery of the mountains and rivers isn't enough." Zhong Qiu smiled and replied, "I've already borrowed money from him once, so borrowing money from him again isn't a big deal. I didn't really consider Mr. Zhong's martial arts cultivation during this trip to the Sword Qi Great Wall, and I apologize for that, Chen Pingan said. Zhong Qiu shook his head and replied, "Don't speak such nonsensically polite words in front of me in the future." Hearing this, Chen Pingan didn't make any more polite remarks. In the end, Zhong Qiu said, "No matter how good a principle is, there are still times when it is unsuitable. It's not that the principle itself is wrong, but rather, people face far too many challenges and unexpected circumstances. The same type of rice can nurture and raise all kinds of different people, but at the end of the day, how many people like those bowls of rice, and how many people genuinely think about the taste of the rice?" Chen Pingan nodded and said, "I'll ponder more about it." Zhong Qiu wanted to say something, but he couldn't help but hesitate. He wanted to say some words of comfort and reassurance, but looking at the young man in azure, he felt like this seemingly wasn't necessary. Thus he decided against saying those words. Pei Qian quietly said, "Master," before falling silent. With the small bamboo bookcase on her back, Guizhuzhou started to count on her fingers, most likely counting how long it would take before her senior sister started to cry. Pei Qian saw Guizhuzhou's actions out of the corners of her eyes, and she no longer had the effort to feel sad. This young girl was truly far too annoying. Chao Qinglang bowed in respect and bid farewell to his master. Chen Pingan lightly waved his hand before placing his hands inside his opposite sleeves. After seeing everyone off, Chen Pingan accompanied Guizhuzhou to the entrance of the city before jumping onto his talismanic boat and making his way to the city wall. "They've all left?" Zuyu asked. Chen Pingan nodded in response. "If you've got something to say, then spit it out," Zuyu said with a frown. Chen Pingan was starting to miss having Pei Qian and Chao Qinglang around. His senior brother would speak to him more politely when they were present. "Senior brother, if I wanted you to agree to master and leave the Sword Qi Great Wall, then I shouldn't have turned down the old Great Sword Immortals proposal, and instead should have agreed to light a bonded candle inside Downtrodden Mountain's ancestral hall," Chen Pingan said in a quiet voice. "If I did that, then at the very least you wouldn't need to worry about me and stay here for my sake. You're only saying half of what you want. Who taught you this?" "Our master," Zuyu asked. "The old Great Sword Immortal has already told me everything. You're not even a sword cultivator, so you won't be able to understand the speed of my sword strikes no matter how you rack your brains. Who gave you the courage to think about all this nonsense? Do you remember what you said to Yu Juanfu before? Perhaps that was only a comment for other people and not for yourself? After working so hard to obtain the principles in your heart, you're now treating them like wine seals and folding fans that can be casually sold for money? If you ask me, I'd say that it's better to not learn these bullshit principles then." Chen Pingan was rendered speechless. Senior brother Zuyu never said a lot to him, yet he was saying so much today, so it looked like his senior brother was truly very angry at him. However, none of this mattered. Chen Pingan had prepared a response already, and he replied, "No matter how busy master is, he'll definitely visit Downtrodden Mountain more often now that Pei Qian, Chao Qinglang, and the others are there. Regarding how you teach sword techniques, I'm sure that your juniors will explain this to master, and master will definitely be happy when he hears about this." It was Zuyu's turn to be rendered speechless. Chen Pingan changed the topic and asked, "Are there many people in the savage world who have yet to forget the Sword Qi Great Wall?" Zuyu nodded and replied naturally. "However, it's still of little use. There are 2 sages from the Confucian sect and the Buddhist sect guarding the 2 ends of the Great Wall, and there's also a sage from the Taoist sect guarding the skies. Is this for the sake of preventing the Sword Qi Great Wall from being polluted and corroded by the fortune of the savage world?" Chen Pingan asked. "This is not an easy task for the 3 sages," Zuyu replied. The Confucian sage, who was once a talented Buddhist monk, joined the lineage of the second sage after losing a debate to master back then, and his knowledge is extremely deep and profound. So, don't think that the lineage of the second sage is pathetic or whatnot. Scholars like us are most afraid of our interests being damaged, and that often causes us to feel frustrated and lay blame in an irrational manner. And don't be so naive as to believe that all of the disciples from the lineage of the etiquette sage are virtuous scholars and noble scholars simply because noble scholar Wang Zhai also belongs to the lineage of the etiquette sage." Chen Pingan shook his head and replied, "I won't see the trees and miss the forest. I won't ignore the bigger picture. Noble scholar Zhong Kuei from the Parasol Leaf continent hailed from the lineage of the second sage, after all. Did Cui Dongshan say anything before he left? Zuyu asked. Only some trivial matters, Chen Pingan replied with a shake of his head. Zuyu fell silent for a long time before slowly saying, apart from Master, no one else saw the young Cui Chan back then. When the others and I saw him, he was already around the same age as you are now. I maintain my belief that the world will slowly become a better place, Chen Pingan suddenly said. That's how it should be, Zuyu said with a smile. Chen Pingan turned around and remarked, Senior brother, you would actually be much more handsome than the Wind Snow Temple's Wei Jin if you smiled more often. Isn't that the case even if I don't smile? Zuyu retorted. Chen Pingan smiled faintly and replied, I agree, but I don't know about Wei Jin. Zuyu nodded and said, I'll ask him later. You also need to observe whether Wei Jin is sincere or not when he answers your question, Chen Pingan added. Zuyu nodded and said, that makes sense. The two of them gazed into the distance together. Those with whom they were familiar had all traveled afar. Just like today when Chen Pingan's friends and disciples had embarked on the long journey home. Not long ago, Qi Jinglong had also left the Sword Qi Great Wall along with Bai Shou and some other young cultivators from the Great Emblem Sword sect. People in the mortal world experienced reunions and partings, as did cultivators and immortals in the mountains. Another year snuck past at the Sword Qi Great Wall, with spring arriving and the flowers blooming again. This time, Ningyao was cultivating in seclusion for a long time, almost as if she had forgotten about summer and winter. In fact, this was most normal for cultivators. Fandach was still yet to break through, but his Dragon Gate tier foundation was becoming sturdier and sturdier. At the same time, he also became very well acquainted with the Ning residents and the Yen clan. Enjoying the tutelage of his clan's chief guest elder, Yenju's sword skills also improved in leaps and bounds. Meanwhile, Chen Sanxiu was still a carefree young master, who always felt like the walls would shuffle over to support him after he became slightly inebriated. Dong Huafu continued to purchase things without spending money no matter where he went. Business at Daizhang's wine shop was still booming, with more and more safety tablets appearing on the walls. It was said that Qi Shou had also entered seclusion, and there was a very big chance that he would become a nascent tier sword cultivator when he exited seclusion. Peng Yuanji frequently visited Daizhang's wine shop to purchase wine, especially since it had recently released a new type of wine that was extremely spicy. It was slightly more on the expensive side, with a single pot of wine costing 3 snowflake coins. Thus, not only did sales of the Bamboo Sea Small World wine, which cost 1 snowflake coin each, not decrease, but they actually increased instead. However, Peng Yuanji didn't lack money, and his friend Sword Immortal Gao Kuei also enjoyed spicier wine. Because of this, Peng Yuanji always felt like he was responsible for half the sales of this new wine. It was a shame that shopkeeper Dai Zhang had learned from the second shopkeeper, becoming increasingly stingy and being unwilling to give a discount of even a single snowflake coin regardless of how much wine a customer purchased at once. In fact, she would even grumble about Peng Yuanji purchasing so much wine. What about the other sword immortals? Peng Yuanji owed her a favor, seeing that she was willing to sell so much wine to him. Peng Yuanji felt extremely troubled. It didn't matter what kind of wine he drank, but Gao Kuei was now addicted to wine despite having no money. Gao Kuei had now reached a critical moment of nurturing his bonded flying sword, and he had quickly gone from a wealthy person swimming in money to a poor bastard who could barely afford food. This was extremely common at the Sword Qi Great Wall. Sword cultivators would either have heaps of spare money, or they would have not even a single copper coin. Not only that, but they would need to borrow money from those around them. Right now, Peng Yuanji was most interested in when the stinky tofu shop would open and start selling the snack. For some unknown reason, the 2 shop attendants in the wine shop were no longer the 2 young boys from Spirit Rhino Alley and Raincoat Alley, and instead it was 1 young boy, 1 young girl, and a dark-skinned little child. They were all neighbors of shopkeeper Dai Zhang, and the most dexterous of the 3 was surprisingly the little child. The alcoholics and gambling addicts all liked to tease the little child, especially since the child had a huge temper despite his young age and small stature. No one was allowed to drink wine on credit regardless of whether they were a sword immortal or not, and the little child would roll his eyes at whoever dared to take extra pickled vegetables and yangchan noodles. He would still carry the pickled vegetables to the tables or to the roadside, but he would make his dissatisfaction very clear. From last winter to this spring, the second shopkeeper largely stayed at home and seldom ever showed himself. Only Guizhuzhou was occasionally able to see her master due to visiting the Ning residence all the time. Whenever she saw her master, she would ask why her senior sister still wasn't returning yet. The feelings between her and the small bookcase were deepening as time went on, and the next time she saw her senior sister, the bookcase would definitely open its mouth and say that it wanted to stay with Guizhuzhou. Over at the Ning residence, Nalin Yexing felt slightly anxious, and he asked Bai Lianshuang whether their future son-in-law was being too hasty and reckless by practicing sword techniques in this manner. Was this truly okay? Nalin Yexing could barely bring himself to attack Chen Pingan with his sword. Grandma Bai was also anxious, but the young mistress was cultivating in seclusion, so who could she discuss this with? And thus, she told Nalin Yexing to pay a visit to Chen Pingan's senior brother on the city wall. Nalin Yexing felt like this was a good suggestion. After making his way over, however, he found that Chen Pingan's senior brother was even more brutal, saying that Chen Pingan could go to the city wall to practice sword techniques with his senior brother if senior Nalin felt like this was taking too much time and delaying his return to the immortal tier. Nalin Yexing left the city wall with a dark expression. Grandma Bai was waiting for him at the entrance of the Ning residence, and upon learning of Zuoyu's attitude, she almost couldn't resist the urge to charge over to the city wall. Nalin Yexing was only able to stop her after persuading her for a long time. Nalin Yexing felt secretly happy after stopping by Lianshuang, and this was because Zuoyu had referred to him as Senior Nalin. This was extremely satisfying, so he would treat himself to some wine. Chen Pingan couldn't blame Grandpa Nalin for being too ruthless when practicing sword techniques tomorrow, as he wouldn't be able to control the power of his flying sword after drinking too much wine. The heat of summer slowly rolled in after several downpours and drizzles of spring rain. On this day, Chen Pingan sat in the pavilion by himself, with his sleeves rolled up as he rested against a column and took a nap in the cool shade. Atop the city wall, Zuoyu opened his eyes and stood up, placing his hand on the hilt of his sword as he peered into the distance. To the south of the city wall, yellow sand billowed into the air and blotted out the sun and the sky, stretching thousands of kilometers as it aggressively surged over. The sandstorm was surprisingly taller than the city wall, and it appeared much like a large wave as it directly crashed toward the Sword Qi Great Wall. On the two ends of the Great Wall, the monk on the straw mat and the Confucian sage both extended a hand at the same time, lightly pushing their palms toward the white mist. A Taoist sage carrying a snow-white horsetail whisk was sitting cross-legged high up in the sky, and when the old Taoist priest gazed forward, what he saw was the sea of clouds beneath him opening up layer by layer. A young girl wearing a braid was initially yawning, leaning on the city wall and dazedly staring at a pot of unopened wine. She happily rolled around a few times at this moment, with a bright glimmer in her eyes as she hollered in a childish voice, "Those below the unpolished jade tier, retreat from the city wall. Those in the north who possess a high enough cultivation base, come over to make up the numbers." Chen Qingdu slowly walked out of his thatched cottage, with his hands clasped behind his back as he walked to Zuoyu's side and nimbly jumped onto the parapet, asking with a smile, "Are you saving your sword qi to eat later?" Zuoyu remained silent, and even though his sword stayed in his scabbard, he no longer suppressed his sword qi in a painstaking manner as he walked forward. Beyond the Sword Qi Great Wall, the tsunami of yellow dust suddenly disintegrated into smithereens as if hitting an invisible wall, unable to push any closer to the Great Wall. Not only that, but the invisible wall of Sword Qi continued to move south, forcing the tsunami of yellow dust to retreat dozens of kilometers. In the end, the sky cleared up again, giving an unobstructed view of the south. Rays of brilliant sword light lit up in the city to the north, dashing to the city wall in the south. In the end, a sea of sword immortals arrived atop the city wall of the Sword Qi Great Wall. There were Chen Qingdu and Zuoyu. There was also Dong Sanging, the hidden official, Chen Shi, Qi Tingji, Nalin Xiaowei, the old deaf guy, and Lu Ji. Then there was Yu Qing, Ning Lianyun, Wu Chengpei, Zhou Cheng, Mi Hu, Mi Yu, Sun Juyuan, Gao Kuei, Tao Wen, and guest elder sword immortal Li Tumi of the Yin clan. In addition to these sword immortals, there was also the northern complete reed continents Han Huizi, the eastern treasured vial continents Wei Jin, the southern world continents Yuan Qingshu, Duckweed Sword Lakes Li Kai, the Shaoyuan Empire's Kuxia, and so on. Chen Qingdu looked into the distance and said with a chuckle, They've grown much bolder after receiving the support of that old bastard. There are quite a few new faces. A lot of them have come, and those who have a seat in that rat hole have almost all made their way over. Johnson and Flying Dumplings' thoughts. How many of these characters can you remember? I've already lost track. Great Sword Immortal Yu Qing was wearing a standard Dao robe from the garment market, and his sword Mighty Guardian of the Five Mountains was hanging by his hip. Compared to this pseudo-celestial tool that wouldn't be carelessly drawn for no reason, Yu Qing was actually more fond of the standard long sword forged by the sword market. Thus, his two hands were resting on none other than the standard sword. Many sword immortals and earth immortal sword cultivators at the Sword Chi Great Wall like to wear Dao robes from the garment market and carry swords forged by the sword market, and this was in no small part thanks to Yu Qing. Sword immortal Zhou Cheng was still rocking back and forth on the swing. A very long time ago, the young man who had said that he was coming here to take a look at his homeland had ultimately died by the hands of a so-called fellow native of the Sword Chi Great Wall for her sake. Zhou Cheng wasn't carrying a sword, and wisps of golden sword intent that had been passed down through the generations continued to swim around her. These were her scabbardless swords. Wu Chengpei was a young and handsome unpolished jade-tier sword immortal, but his face was contorted, and the rims of his eyes were red at this moment. Amazing. Very well. There was an especially large number of great demons today, both familiar faces as well as unfamiliar faces. Sword Immortal Yuan Qingshu from the southern world continent was standing beside Sword Immortal Gao Kuei, with the latter's expression solemn as he used his mind's lake to describe the backgrounds of some lofty great demons to the former. Some great demons had scuttled around everywhere to hide for countless years. Yet they had all come out of hiding and gathered together on the battlefield in the south today. Something like this hadn't happened in 10,000 years, especially with the 14 great demons leading the army being the same great demons standing at the forefront of the old lunar almanacs, the Baizhe album and the Mountain Scouring album. Afterward, the many different editions published in the majestic world no longer recorded the existence of these great demons. In fact, even Gao Kuei admitted that he had never seen these great demons in person before. Fortunately, the savage world had decided to gather them together today, saving the Sword Chi Great Wall the effort of looking for them one by one. Yuan Qingshu grabbed his sword nurturing gourd to drink some wine, taking a sip every time Gao Kuei finished describing the ancient background of a great demon. Wine tasted extremely delicious when using the names of these great demons as a snack. Sect leader Han Huizi of the Great Emblem Sword Sect was resting his mind with his eyes closed, and he would occasionally tap his sword as he kept his palm on its hilt. Standing beside him was Duckweed Sword Lake Sect leader Li Kai, another sword immortal from the northern complete reed continent. There was a bright glimmer in Li Kai's eyes. Very well. All of these great demons looked very capable. There were two outsiders who didn't appear like sword immortals and appeared more like a fisherman and a woodsman, and the two of them were like-minded friends from the mountains of the pure white continent, Sword Immortal Zhang Xiao and Sword Immortal Li Ding. They had initially felt a little solemn, but after exchanging a glance, the two of them smiled knowingly and became unwavering in their resolve to fight to the death. Zhao Gi sat still and glanced back. Chang Quan should have been sitting on the city wall in the north, but he had become a pitiful insect languishing at the nascent tier after being severely wounded by a great demon and suffering a fall in cultivation base. Only sword cultivators at the upper 5 tiers were allowed at the front, so Chang Quan could only swear and curse as he walked away. Zhao Gi laughed heartily as he retracted his gaze. He and Chang Quan had competed with each other from a young age, whether that be their cultivation bases, the quality of their flying swords, their destructive ability, and even their romantic relationships. Chang Quan had maintained a winning edge over Zhao Gi the entire time, but now? Not only did he possess a higher cultivation base, but in terms of charging forward and fighting to the death, the measly nascent tier Chang Quan didn't even have the opportunity to do so. Chang Quan could obediently stay behind and eat his dust. When I die, I'll go and see her in the afterlife first. I'll anger you to death, Chang Quan. Nailan Yeshing felt slightly angry. Couldn't these beasts from the savage world wait for a moment longer before charging over to seek death? Once he returned to the immortal tier, wouldn't these beasts enjoy a more satisfying death by the blade of his flying sword? However, Nailan Yeshing also felt slightly puzzled at the same time. The formation of these beasts was quite strange. In the past, the sky would be blotted out with an army as dense as locusts, while the earth would also be covered in a carpet of beasts as tightly packed as ants and rats. To his surprise, however, this wasn't the case today. Perhaps the savage world wanted to rely on just these great demons to breach the city wall? Chen Pingan's wine was yet to penetrate the market of the savage world. So why were the brains of these great demons already fried? Han Huizi smiled faintly, with his expression carefree and his aura full of spirit and vigor. The Great Emblem Sword sect won't feel any guilt after this battle. The hidden official rubbed her palms and cracked her knuckles, occasionally wiping the corners of her mouth as she muttered, "It looks like a battle is going to break out. If I'm still alive after this battle ends, then not only can I drink wine, but I can definitely drink to my heart's content." Some sword immortals were squatting along the perimeter of the parapet and stroking the edges and corners of the wall, with their expressions cold and filled with a hint of commemoration for those who had died before them. Some sword immortals cracked open pots of wine, paying respects in their hearts as they slowly poured wine onto the city wall. They then casually tossed the empty pots beyond the city wall. The old deaf guy was expressionless, thinking only about when he could walk down the city wall and return to his small den. The wind atop the city wall was truly too strong. Mihu's expression was solemn. It could be said that these uninvited guests were coming with profoundly ill intentions. Immortal Tierly Toomey smiled bitterly. Alrighty. This time it wasn't just Fatty Yen who was nice and plump and ready to be eaten. Looking at the enemy formation, he was also part of the meal plan. Casting one's gaze to the vast lands lying south of the city wall, 14 thrones in total were lined up in a row, with some higher and some lower, some larger and some smaller. It was as if this were the strangest ancestral hall in the world. The layout of the seats was slightly different from that of the ancestral halls in the majestic world. Apart from the 14 extremely unfamiliar great demons, the remaining great demons were all familiar faces that had appeared in front of the Sword Chi Great Wall over the past 100 years. In comparison to the great demons on the thrones, however, these great demons no longer appeared so great. They had initially attracted the most gazes and faced the most flying swords on the battlefield, but now they were obediently standing behind the line of 14 thrones. These were the rules of the savage world. Simple, crude, and direct, much more direct than even the Sword Chi Great Wall. This was something that the majestic world, which liked to be superficial, absolutely couldn't compare to. Chen Qingdu clasped his hands behind his back and said after a soft chuckle, "When one's sword skills are high enough, the scene before us will appear like the most beautiful and majestic artwork. It feels like any casual swing of the sword will strike a target. What do you say, Zuiyu?" Zuiyu grabbed the hilt of his sword and replied, "I never think about that much when I unleash my sword." Chen Qingdu glanced further south. As expected of the owner of that world, they were located slightly further away, and if it weren't for them voluntarily appearing in the open, they would have truly been impossible to notice. Chen Qingdu retracted his gaze and looked at the great demons who were mighty and imposing in their formation. There were some with whom he had fought before, but had managed to escape alive due to various kinds of reasons. For example, good fortune, being able to flee quickly, having thick skin to avoid being hacked to death, and so on. Of course, these were all battles from many years ago. As for whether there would still be battles many years into the future, that was difficult to say. They had performed a simulation once, concluding that the savage world could breach and overrun the Sword Chi Great Wall if it gathered half of its combat power. This wasn't just an empty threat to scare people. This was the reality. However, these beasts liked to have internal fights with each other, and with that old bastard not dying and not even appearing in public, the savage world was missing a leader and a backbone, someone who could truly rival Chen Qingdu. As a result, they were ultimately too disorganized. In the past, they had been on the path to victory during many assaults on the Great Wall, yet after suffering a few more casualties and facing some significant hits, there would always be great demons that decided to retreat, leading their tribes back to rest and recuperate. Other times, some great sword immortals would venture deep into enemy territory to slay a great demon, and other great demons would seize the opportunity to swallow up the land and subordinates of the slain great demon. They would completely forget about attacking the Sword Chi Great Wall, which would be a useless piece of territory even if they managed to conquer it. There had only been one time in history, the most dangerous time, when the heroic spirit hall of the savage world, which Chen Qingdu referred to as the Rat Nest, had summoned close to half of the owners of the thrones, with each taking a vow and agreeing on how the benefits would be distributed. A huge battle had followed, one which was truly violent and tragic. If Chen Qingdu remembered correctly, he was the only person left standing on the entire city wall. The spell formation on the northern city wall had almost been shattered, which would have comprehensively severed the future of the Sword Qi Great Wall. Many senior sword immortals had fallen in that battle, and many so-called children had also sacrificed their lives. Chen Qingdu sighed and said slowly, there should indeed be a conclusion between the three sides. Some had been the descendants of those prisoners for 10,000 years, so it was time for them to give him an answer. Far away in the south, there was a shattered and upside-down mountain where iron chains pierced through countless humongous boulders. Much like Stalactite Mountain, the peak of the mountain pointed toward the earth, while the foot faced the sky. The elevated foot of the upside-down mountain was as smooth as a mirror, and under the radiance of the sun, the eye-catching shimmer made it appear like the biggest gold essence copper coin in the world. Atop this platform was a great demon wearing a gold robe, with their appearance unable to be seen clearly. The great demon made a grabbing motion, collecting a large handful of semi-tangible gold-colored copper coins. However, these copper coins quickly flowed through the gaps between the great demon's fingers like water, falling to the ground. They were ultimately not real and tangible enough, and they needed to be reinforced and completed by many deities from the majestic world. Only at that time would this great demon's gold essence throne become legitimate and live up to its name. According to the agreement, it would receive the shattered golden shards of the slain deities in one entire continent of the majestic world as payment for participating in this battle. However, it was a shame that this wasn't enough. Far from enough. If it wanted to become as lofty and imposing as the blazing sun in the sky, unrestrained by the great Tao for tens of millions of years and truly uncorroded by time, then it needed to consume even more. It was best that it could even consume the fabled reincarnations of those gods belonging to the heavenly court. Only then would it feel satiated. There was a large collection of jade buildings hovering in the sky, and a great demon that had assumed human form was sitting on a railing, as if he were guarding his immense wealth by himself. He smiled widely as he looked at the Sword Qi Great Wall. He had heard before that there existed a cloud-stop pavilion constructed from immortal jade located further north of the city wall, and there was also the Myriad Ravine residence, which enjoyed the peaceful rustling of pine trees whenever the moon was bright and the wind was gentle. These buildings could seemingly add some extra flavor to his residence, though they would appear largely insignificant compared to the grand size of the existing structures. He would only feel satisfied if he managed to obtain the so-called archway that assembled the characteristics of all teachings owned by the southern world continent's pure Confucian Chan clan. It would be even better if he could grab the ancient ascension platform of a large world owned by the small eastern treasured Vile continent. There was the colossal corpse of a deity floating in the sky, and sitting on the head of the corpse was a great demon. Beside the great demon was a spear piercing through the head of the deity, with the spear body buried inside the head, leaving only the tip and the tail visible. There was the subtle rumbling of thunder at the tip of the spear, causing the entire corpse to shudder and sway. The great demon lightly patted the tip of its sword. It had heard that cultivators in the majestic world were skilled at the five lightning righteous technique, especially those from Mount Longhu's heavenly master residence in the Middle Earth divine continent. It could find an opportunity to battle with them. There was a skeletal throne constructed from countless white bones belonging to hundreds of thousands of corpses, both demons and sword cultivators. A fleshless skeletal great demon, whose entire body glowed like jade, stood with one foot atop the skull of an ancient great sword immortal. As the great demon drank, it used the tip of its foot to roll the skull around the ground. The great demon stopped drinking, changing its posture in the skeletal throne before tilting the wine cup in its hand and pouring blood-red wine onto the skull. A short moment later, the skull slowly rose into the air, and as more and more wine flowed from the cup, flesh, tendons, and bones gradually grew from the skull. In the end, it transformed into an old man standing 3 meters tall, with his appearance identical to that of humans. The skeletal great demon flicked its sleeve, and the slightly rigid old man reached out and grabbed the streak of bright light. His eyes empty and his movements stiff, the old man's aura instantly became towering and imposing like a sword immortal the moment that he grabbed the streak of light. there was an ancient pillar that measured 3,000 meters in height, inscribed with talismanic characters that had long been lost to the world. A sanguine snake was wrapped around the pillar, with many lusterless flood dragon jewels circling around its body. The sanguine snake hissed as it stared intently at the great wall, and it only had one goal after they crushed this mud wall that had stood for 10,000 years and flattened Stalactite Mountain. Its goal was that little creature that could just qualify as a true dragon, the last of its kind in the human world. Afterward, the sanguine snake could complete its great Tao, and the clouds and rain and the heavenly Tao of water would all fall under its control. Severely damaged and worn robe slowly emerged in the sky. The robe was empty, and it fluttered loudly as it swayed with the wind. When this mysterious and ownerless robe appeared, some primordial sword intents near the Sword Chi Great Wall rejoiced as if they were encountering an old friend, while even more sword intents were seemingly weeping. There were also countless sword intents growing increasingly irritated and furious, seemingly scolding the gray robe. There was a stunningly beautiful woman with a human head and a flood dragon body wearing a crown and dressed in an ink-black dragon robe, sitting on a dragon throne that was as large as a mountain peak. Her extremely long flood dragon body extended beyond the throne, and each time the tip of her tail lightly slapped the ground, a violent tremor would travel dozens of kilometers and send plumes of dust into the air. In stark contrast to her colossal body, there were hundreds upon thousands of insignificantly small women around her, slender and beautiful like the celestial maidens in the murals as they held pipa in their laps and their colorful ribbons flowed in the wind. There was a short old man standing on a hovering sword, with his arms as long as those of apes and his hands casually resting on a long staff that was sitting on his shoulder. His hair and eyebrows were all white, yet he was dressed in black, with a sword slowly hovering around him. He would occasionally breathe in, sucking one or two pipa women into his mouth from his neighbor's territory and slowly chewing. The old man had prayer beads around one wrist, but these prayer beads were especially rough and crude. In fact, they were nothing more than jagged stones of various sizes. The beautiful woman sitting on the dragon throne nearby paid no heed to the old man's actions, and she even flicked her sleeve and actively pushed a dozen or so maidservants toward him, allowing him to devour them. A Taoist priest wearing snow-white robes sat in mid-air. His appearance was blurry, and he measured more than 900 meters in height. This wasn't his Tao manifestation, and it was, in fact, his true body. There was a bright crescent moon hanging behind the Taoist priest, almost as if he had plucked the moon from the sky and brought it to the mortal world. There was a giant with 3 heads and 6 arms sitting on a gigantic mat made from a large number of golden books, and despite sitting on the ground, he was still taller than the Taoist priest sitting in midair beside him. There was a startling sword gash on his chest, but the giant didn't go out of his way to conceal this extremely deep wound. Instead, he would only wipe away this wound when he managed to exact revenge for this utter humiliation. There was a big bearded man with neat clothes standing extremely high up in the air, and a saber by his hip and a sword strapped to his back. A young man was standing beside him with a sword case on his back, with his clothes ragged and a huge number of swords resting in the sword case. This made the skinny and frail young man look like a peacock displaying its colorful tail. This big bearded man had been summoned to the secret meeting at the Heroic Spirit Hall last time, yet he still hadn't attended, not even willing to show his face. However, no one had dared to say anything at the time. Even higher up, a man wearing Confucian robes was sitting upright, with a smile on his face as his hands were folded in front of his abdomen. There was a fist-sized orb of light resting on his palm, shifting unpredictably between snow-white, pitch black, and multicolored. An extremely handsome young man stood in a middling position, not only taking human form, but even adopting the size of ordinary humans. Looking closely, however, his face was actually stitched together, and the old sword nurturing gourd hanging by his waist held not wine, but the remnant souls of sword immortals as well as many bonded flying swords that had already lost their spirit and intent. Much like the great demons around him, it had also been a very long time since he had last appeared in the world. The contents in his sword-nurturing gourd had all been offered to him by his disciples and grand-disciples. A burly man dressed in a suit of golden armor stood on the ground with his fists tightly clenched, and golden light that was as thick as oil continued to drip from the gaps between his armor. This suit of golden armor, which was a celestial tool but was still on the verge of collapse, wasn't a rare treasure that the burly man was wearing of his own volition, but rather something that was akin to a cage. Humans had risen to the top 10,000 years ago, driving the demon tribe to the vast and desolate lands that lacked both natural resources and spiritual energy. Afterward, the sword cultivators had been banished to what was now the Sword Chi Great Wall, which they had started to construct and guard. Beyond the Sword Chi Great Wall was the so-called Savage World, one of the 4 large worlds that the former world had split into. When the Savage World had just formed, heaven and earth were still young, and the Great Tao had been nothing more than an unstable shell. There had been 3 prisoner sword cultivators at the Sword Chi Great Wall, with Chen Pingan leading the others and challenging the demons atop Holding Moon Mountain. Afterward, the demon ancestor had disappeared without a trace, stripping the demon tribe of their leader. It was because of this that the Savage World and the Sword Chi Great Wall had fought for the next 10,000 years. Meanwhile, the ancient well that was referred to as the Heroic Spirit Hall was a place where future generations of great demons held meetings and locked up prisoners. In reality, Holding Moon Mountain was the earliest location that had become similar to the imperial cities of the mortal world, but following the battle there, Chen Pingan had returned to the Sword Chi Great Wall by himself, leaving behind an utterly destroyed Holding Moon Mountain. As a result, the great demons had been left with no option but to construct another so-called capital, the Heroic Spirit Hall, to meet up and discuss matters. Even so, the 14 thrones had never once enjoyed a full gathering over the past 10,000 years, with at most 6 or 7 great demons gathering together at any one time. In fact, even this was rare, and it would only occur when the Savage World had significant matters to discuss. Sometimes just 2 or 3 great demons would gather to make decisions. After that sudden conflict, where an earth-shattering battle of life and death had taken place, countless demons and beasts had gained power and enjoyed a great rise, rushing to mark their own territories. The burly man in golden armor had been the most capable of them all. With the demon ancestor, the only individual capable of commanding the respect and obedience of all the great demons, having vanished completely after that huge battle, the burly man in golden armor had resolved to fight for that paramount position and become the new ruler of the Savage World. However, he had failed to ascend Holding Moon Mountain, so he had thus been subject to punishment according to the rules, with the great demons responsible for guarding the mountain working together to imprison him at the bottom of the ancient well in the Heroic Spirit Hall. The burly man had calculated and schemed, eventually colluding with the outside world and overcoming many difficulties to break free from his imprisonment. Unexpectedly, a young Taoist priest riding an ox had coincidentally been traveling around the Savage World, and after arriving near the ancient well, he had stood above the well and extended a finger, lightly pressing the great demon back to the bottom of the well. Having finally climbed out of the well after an immense struggle, the incredibly senior great demon was not only pushed back to the bottom, but golden light had further rained down on him, firmly restraining him and preventing any further escape. Thankfully, great demons enjoyed extremely long lifespans, something that the humans nurtured by the primordial deities couldn't hope to rival. If great demons chose to slumber, the flow of time would have significantly less effect on them, and it was thanks to this that the burly man had finally managed to wait until the arrival of that elderly individual, who allowed him to make up for his wrongs while he remained a criminal. Casting one's gaze toward that unmoving horizontal line in the south, there was the great demon wearing a golden robe atop the upside-down mountain. There was the great demon sitting alone on the railing amid the many jade buildings, appearing like those primordial immortals described in the books of the majestic world. A man stood atop the skulls of deities, and the spear pierced through the head of a corpse contained the purest divine lightning intent of the entire savage world. Atop the skeletal throne, there was a primordial great sword immortal that had been crafted into a puppet and returned to the pinnacle of its power. A blood-red snake was wrapped around a column, appearing like a ruler that commanded all water deities in the savage world. A Taoist priest in snow-white robes had refined half of the 3 moons' essence into his bonded item. The giant with 3 heads and 6 arms had once been the first to ascend the Sword Chi Great Wall, managing to live even after facing a sword strike from Chen Pingan. When it marched into the majestic world this time, all ancestral halls, regardless of size, would be pulverized into smithereens. The beautiful woman wearing a crown and dressed in dragon robes had ambitions of becoming the ruler of the martial world across the 9 continents of the majestic world, allowing her to control the flow of incense in the mortal world. as well as the reincarnation of deities. In return, she would give the elite cavalry river to another great demon who had the same seniority as her. No longer competing against the great demons in the savage world. No one had trusted each other in the beginning, and everyone had wanted to devour the others. The situation now was completely different, with each great demon having even loftier ambitions. The owner of the ragged robe had once departed the Sword Chi Great Wall together with Chan Qingdu, being one of the 3 sword cultivators who had challenged the great demons atop Holding Moon Mountain. He had once been a very close friend of Chan Qingdu. The big bearded man who had his only disciple standing beside him had fought with Aoyang before, and had also drunk wine with him before. Feeling bored one time, he had also helped the blind old man move around the large mountains. When the human world was completely destroyed, the man wearing Confucian robes would make his way to the majestic world to rebuild the mountains and rivers, after which he would spread his teachings to educate the beings of the world without discrimination. The great demon that had been suppressed by the suit of golden armor for countless years not only wanted to charge into the majestic world, but he even wanted to lead an army and march to the White Jade capital. The old man on the hovering sword wanted to refine all of the 5 mountains in the majestic world and transform them into his own possessions. He would also personally obliterate the 9 mighty suppressing pagodas, after which he would ask Bai Zhe what the hell he was thinking. The handsome man with a sword nurturing gourd by his hip felt like his ambitions were already the smallest. He simply wanted to collect all of the beautiful faces in the majestic world, and in any case the female cultivators in the mountains could still survive even if they lost their faces. If they were unwilling to live after losing their faces, then there was no need for him to do anything, and there would naturally be hundreds upon thousands of ways for them to die. These 14 great demons represented the pinnacle of the savage world. Most of them had been woken from their endlessly long slumbers. Some of them had been awake the entire time, but they had remained hidden in their dens, choosing to spectate the conflict at the Sword Chi Great Wall from the sidelines. They never participated in the assaults that took place roughly once every 100 years. The thrones in the heroic spirit hall didn't stay unchanged for all eternity, and the number of thrones wasn't fixed either. Some great demons died, some thrones would crumble by themselves and fall to the bottom of the well, and some younger great demons might rise and win themselves a seat in the heroic spirit hall. There was no notion of experience, and those who possessed paramount combat power could enjoy thrones that towered higher above the others. Indeed, the weak deserved to gaze up at the strong. The history of the savage world was a story of the strong trampling on the ant-like corpses of the weak, gradually ascending higher and achieving great feats. There were also mortal empires that rose in the vast lands, no inferior to those in the majestic world. They also adhered to rules and etiquette, some more than others, but all of them had ultimately succumbed to terrible fates, unable to remain in the savage world. These empires were unable to withstand the stampede of those great demons that had gone from neutral to enemies, becoming nothing more than small splashes in the long river of time. Overwhelming individual strength was the ultimate ambition of the elites in the savage world. Everything else was insignificant. All of the internal struggles, the extermination of tens of thousands of demon tribes, the death of countless ants, all of these were solid steps on the path of a powerful great demon ascending to the peak. This small group of paramount individuals would then counterbalance each other, preventing them from marching toward destruction together. This was the only rule in the savage world. The existences in the heroic spirit hall, and the increase or decrease of thrones in the ancient well were all dictated by this single rule. The 14 great demons suddenly descended to the ground. An old man in gray slowly walked out from the middle, holding the hand of a little boy. The little boy held a decapitated head by its hair, with the deceased man's eyes wide and unafraid. It appeared as if he had failed to exact revenge for a huge grudge. A bowing and subservient ascension tier great demon walked behind the old man in gray and the little boy, and he was none other than the great demon that had been responsible for the previous assault on the Sword Chi Great Wall. The great demon that had subsequently been pursued by sword immortals Wu Yu. The great demon had named himself Zhongguang, and he was an ancient and lofty being in the savage world. Great demon Zhongguang naturally didn't dare to assume his true form and swagger behind the old man in gray. After the old man in gray stopped, Zhongguang acted according to his instructions and strode forward, approaching the Sword Chi Great Wall by himself and announcing loudly, Sword immortals who don't use their full power in the subsequent battle will be spared when the Sword Chi Great Wall falls, and you'll be free to travel around the savage world or enjoy the scenery in the majestic world. The lower 5-tier sword cultivators on the city wall, those who are unwilling to fight can leave, and you'll be esteemed guests of the savage world in the future. There was silence on the city wall. Dongseng chuckled coldly and spat. Upper 5-tier beasts in the south, those who ascend the city wall first can die first. Zhongguang turned around and looked back. After all, it wasn't his place to make any threats. The old man in gray patted the little boy's head and said, "Go on. You were old friends in the past, so you can now greet Chen Qingdu as a direct disciple of Holding Moon Mountain." The little boy slowly walked forward with the decapitated head in his hand, which was caked in dry blood. He walked quicker and quicker, releasing a thunder-like rumble. When he finally came to a stop, he forcefully tossed the head forward, causing it to fly through the air before tumbling along the ground. The owner of the head was a great sword immortal from the Sword Chi Great Wall, who had concealed himself in the savage world for 600 years. Not only did this great sword immortal possess lofty sword skills, but he was also a master of political games, with many conflicts and battles between the great demons arising as a result of his schemes. The little boy felt slightly upset as he turned around and said, "Master, my cultivation base is too low right now, and there's quite a lot of sword chi on the city wall, so I'm not able to throw the head onto the city wall." The old man in gray smiled and replied, "It's the thought that counts. In any case, the expressions of those sword immortals are already very satisfying." The little boy cracked a grin and shifted his gaze, appearing slightly provocative as he looked at the young man standing beside the big bearded man. The skinny young man remained silent, but the numerous swords in the sword case on his back were all drawn 1 inch from their scabbards. The old man in gray gazed up at the city wall, focusing his attention on only a single person. Old great sword immortal Chen Qingdu. Chen Qingdu clasped his hands behind his back and cast his gaze over the vast lands. After locking eyes with the old man in gray, he extended a hand and casually beheaded an Ascension tier great demon in the dungeon to the north, summoning its head to his hand in an instant. He smiled faintly and said, "I especially saved this head for you for so many years. This great demon is also a direct disciple of Holding Moon Mountain." The old man in gray smiled and remarked, "Chen Qingdu, it's only been 10,000 years, yet you've already become this powerful?" He paused for a moment before eventually continuing, "Then I'll let you experience death once again?" Many outsider sword immortals on the city wall were extremely confused. As expected of someone who's been hiding underground and suppressing their resentment for 10,000 years. "It's no wonder that you're making such bold threats straight away," Chen Qingdu replied. The old man in gray shook his head and commented, "I've heard that your new sword is called Lasting Qi. This is fairly mediocre." "No, it's far too mediocre." Chen Qingdu remained standing with his hands clasped behind his back, and he retorted with a faint smile, "You'll only get the opportunity to know whether I can last long or not if you're a lady." There were loud whistles on the city wall. By the looks of it, it wasn't only sword cultivators in the city who enjoyed such vulgar jokes. Sword immortals were much the same. The little boy returned to the old man in gray's side, tugging his master's sleeve and saying, his retort was very impressive. The old man in gray didn't become angry, and he looked down at his closing disciple, whose soul was still incomplete despite so much effort searching for it. He instead smiled and said, "These people are all talk regardless of whether they're dead or alive, and no matter whether they're sword cultivators or not. If you so desire, you can feel free to learn this lowliest of skills in the majestic world in the future." The great demon sitting on a railing amid the numerous immortal jade buildings laughed and remarked, "Chen Qingdu, you're truly respectable, detestable, and most of all pitiful. You've locked up so many great demons without killing them, using them as whetstones for the sword immortals and utilizing them as materials for that alchemical pill market. This has probably resulted in many scholars in the majestic world criticizing and scolding you, right? You're dragging the entire Sword Chi Great Wall over here to wait for death, so you're presumably resented by many of your own people as well, am I correct? Say, aren't you very pitiful? You've already died once, yet you're still being backstabbed by those around you. Chen Qingdu, oh Chen Qingdu, I would just kill myself and be done with everything if I were you." Chen Qingdu completely ignored this profoundly powerful great demon. Zui looked at the ethereal jade building and asked, Are you worthy of speaking to the old great sword immortal? The great demon laughed and replied, perhaps I'm not entirely worthy of speaking to Chen Pingan, but I'm more than worthy enough to speak to you. The little boy walked forward by himself again, eventually arriving beside the great sword immortal's head and placing a foot on it. He looked up and smiled, saying, I'm 12 years old right now, and I've heard that the sword chi great wall is full of prodigies. Have someone around the same age as me come out to fight me. I won't bully you guys either, and I'll accept any sword cultivator under 30 years old. Oh, and remember to bring some extra pseudo-celestial tools and immortal treasures and whatnot, or else you won't stand a chance. Old sword immortal Qi Tingji furrowed his brows and said, this little brat wants Ningyao to accept his challenge, and after they fight to the death, they want you to leave the city wall, giving that old bastard an advantage. Chen Pingan nodded and replied with a smile, this is indeed what they're planning, but it doesn't matter. How can we guard the sword chi great wall if we can't even overcome this provocation? Chen Pingan waved a hand. A group of youths appeared behind him with Pang Yuanji, Chen Sanxiu, and Dong Huafu among the dozen or so people. Of course, there was also Ning Yao, who had already exited seclusion, as well as Chen Pingan, who had initially been standing inside the pavilion atop dragon-slaying cliff. Chen Pingan extended his arm and raised the head of the great demon, turning around and asking with a smile, who's going to help me deliver this reciprocal gift? Ning Yao stepped forward, yet a hand immediately grabbed her shoulder. Let me go, Chen Pingan said. Chen Pingan smiled widely and asked, are you not afraid of using up your one opportunity here? How will you deal with the next large-scale battle? I'll think about it then, Chen Pingan replied with a smile. Chen Pingan casually tossed away the head of the Ascension Tier Great Demon and said, let go and fight to your heart's content. A figure in azure leaped onto the parapet before striding forward and sprinting down along the Great Wall. He suddenly stood still, and it was as if his feet had become powerful roots as he bent his knees slightly before shooting south like a ferocious arrow, allowing him to catch the plummeting head. He held the head in one hand and placed his other hand behind his back as he gracefully hovered to the ground. On the other side, the little boy flicked the dusty head of the sword immortal up and caught it in his hand before slowly walking forward. There were 100 or so paces between Chen Pingan and the little boy. Why don't we have the result of this battle determine which of us steps forward to face a sword strike? Chen Pingan asked with a cold chuckle. The old man in gray nodded and replied, why not? On the ground, the little boy grinned and beckoned with his hand. Chen Pingan directly threw the head of the great demon over, and the little boy also flung his arm at the same time, throwing the head of the sword immortal high in the air. The little boy didn't reach forward to catch the head of his companion from holding Moon Mountain, and he instead stomped it to the ground with his foot and patted away the blood on his clothes. He leaned forward and crossed his arms, saying, you look so light and frail. Are you sure you can put up a good fight? Chen Pingan caught the head of the great sword immortal, whose name he didn't know, and lightly ran his hand across the sword immortal's face, allowing him to close his eyes. However, this action exposed a huge opening. Following the little boy's punch, the figure in azure slid back dozens of meters and left a shallow ditch in the ground. However, he remained steady and standing the entire time. The little boy stood in the young man's initial position and nodded in approval, saying in exuberance, not too shabby. You can play with me for a good while. Chen Pingan looked back with the head of the sword immortal having disappeared from his hand. Great sword immortal Yu Qing placed the head under his arm and cupped his fists in gratitude at the young man. The little boy smiled and said, it's your turn to throw a punch now. You have one chance and I'm going to use my full strength afterward. You're going to die very, very quickly. You'll definitely die even quicker than the useless parents of my original opponent, Ning Yao. Chen Pingan turned around to look at the little boy before lowering his head and rolling up his sleeves. The corners of his mouth curled up into a smile, which grew wider and wider. However, his eyes became increasingly still, and the matter that was being suppressed with much difficulty in his heart could finally break free and raise its dragon head. So when he finally looked up, he displayed the face of a viciously smiling young man. There was one good aspect for cultivators who had truly attained the great Tao. It was as if death and parting didn't genuinely exist, and as long as the necessary fated opportunity arrived, they could still reunite with their companions. What did it matter that 10,000 years had passed? He was able to see Chen Pingan again, and Chen Qingdu was also able to see him again. The only difference was that he was standing on one bank along the river of time, while Chen Qingdu was standing on the opposite bank. The little boy didn't spare so much as a single glance at the young man whose name he didn't know. Instead, he looked up at the city wall, training his gaze on the old man standing with his hands clasped behind his back. He was Chen Qingdu, more commonly known as the Old Great Sword Immortal. His master and senior brother had never hidden anything from him ever since he gained sentience, so not only was Chen Qingdu an old friend of his master, but he was also an old friend of his. Back then, the three most experienced, skillful and destructive prisoner sword cultivators had banded together to travel afar, seizing the opportunity when the great Tao of the savage world was yet to stabilize, the rotation of the sun and moon was yet to settle, and the cycle of the 4 seasons was still uncertain. No matter what, his master had already been recognized as the owner by the great Tao of the savage world back then. Even so, Chen Qingdu, Guanzhao and Long Jun, the 3 leaders of the prisoners, had still risked having their sword skills suppressed by the savage world to charge to Holding Moon Mountain. This was essentially an act of challenging the entire savage world to a duel. The savage world didn't keep any records of that battle, with only a tiny handful of people knowing what had transpired. Listening to the recount from a senior brother from Holding Moon Mountain, the little boy had heard that this was genuinely an earth-shattering battle that had affected an area with a radius of tens of thousands of kilometers. The height of Holding Moon Mountain had been shaved in half, thanks to the final sword strike of that man wearing ragged clothes before his death. As for the initial formation of the majestic elite cavalry river, it was said that the little boy had been responsible for this in his previous life. However, the little boy had suffered the worst fate, with his soul breaking apart and dispersing everywhere. Throughout the generations, the guardians of Holding Moon Mountain had always been responsible for a secret task, that being to find and gather the pieces of the little boy's soul. Until today, however, they had only managed to piece together 1 immortal soul, and 1 mortal form of the original 3 immortal souls and 7 mortal forms. As for his physical body, this had already been destroyed a very long time ago, rendering it impossible to gather and piece back together. In this sense, the little boy wasn't as fortunate as Long Jun, seeing that the latter at least had a head remaining. However, it was a shame that the skeletal demon who had named himself Bai Ying liked to keep the head under his foot all year round, and when he felt the urge, he would pour some wine and use some unorthodox spell technique to transform the head into a puppet that possessed the combat power of a great sword immortal. It was a shame that the little boy was unable to learn this spell technique. Otherwise, just how much fun could he have after they destroyed the Sword Chi Great Wall? For some unknown reason, however, Long Jun, who had only lost 1 immortal soul and 2 immortal forms, allowing him to keep the majority of his sentience, not only didn't appear in public with his true appearance, but he didn't even attempt to take his head back from Bai Ying, allowing the great demon that was roughly the same strength as him to continue trampling all over it. He had once been a like-minded friend of Chen Qingdu, following him into battle around the world as one of the earliest sword immortals of the human race. Now, however, he mysteriously harbored an intense feeling of resentment toward Chen Qingdu. The little boy raised a hand and yawned, quietly waiting for his opponent to throw a punch. The outcome of this battle was a foregone conclusion, so this was truly very boring. He shifted his gaze from Chen Qingdu to the young woman standing on the edge of the city wall, Ning Yao. She was a young sword cultivator who was extremely renowned in the savage world, and this had little to do with her cultivation base. Rather, it was her future potential that decided her lofty standing in the hearts of many great demons in the savage world. What was a prodigy? These were people who could reach that future as long as they were given a few days or a few years. This future would arrive in the blink of an eye without any mishap. The little boy could be considered one such prodigy, and the bastard young man who was carrying a Maha's sword case could be regarded as half a prodigy. That young man had a strange name, and he was simply called Bai Jie. Bai Jie's master was truly very impressive. Even the little boy's master had remarked that it was a shame that Bai Jie's master wasn't domineering enough, preventing his sword skills from reaching the pinnacle. Otherwise, he was the most suitable candidate for suppressing the Sword Chi Great Wall. It was said that there was also a young man who practiced fist techniques in the majestic world's Middle-earth divine continent, someone by the name of Chao Ci. He was also similarly prodigious as the little boy. The little boy stood with a foot on the head of the Ascension Tier Great Demon, one that was technically his senior brother from holding Moon Mountain. However, he had most likely suffered too many wounds and had his cultivation base ground down too much in the prison under the Sword Chi Great Wall, allowing Chen Qingdu to so casually and easily rip off his head. Of course, despite the Great Demon's Ascension tier cultivation base becoming unstable, his physique was still that of a Great Demon after all. As such, the little boy wouldn't be able to damage this Great Demon's body, even if he hacked it with a celestial tool for several years. Sure enough, Chen Qingdu was still very powerful. This trip with his master to the Sword Chi Great Wall had allowed him to see so many people on the verge of death, as well as all of the so-called upper 5-tier sword immortals on the city wall. This was a very worthwhile trip. The little boy was already 12, yet he still looked like a small child. He was thinking about many things right now, but in actual fact, only a few blinks of the eye had passed on the battlefield. He smacked his lips and said, "I'm going to purposely leave you alive and only beat you half dead. Will Ning Yao come down to help you finish the rest of the fight? If she does, then you'll truly be very fortunate, and the 2 or even 4 worlds in the future will all remember your name. You would be my first opponent following my entrance to this world, yet you would actually manage to walk away alive." The old man, standing on a flying sword and carrying a staff on his shoulder, had once used a hibernation technique to devour a dozen or so towering mountains in the savage world, and after waking from his slumber of several thousand years, he chuckled softly and asked the woman in dragon robes beside him, "Is this child acting on a whim, or is he acting on instructions from the old ancestor?" The woman shook her head and replied, "The old ancestor is only concerned about Chen Qingdu and the Sword Chi Great Wall. He's not interested in the other small and trivial matters." As the owner of Elite Cavalry River and 36 other rivers that span longer than 5,000 kilometers each, the woman in dragon robes hadn't fallen into a slumber. More accurately, the blood-red snake with which she had initially battled over the Great Tao hadn't allowed her to cultivate in peace. The 2 of them had fought violently for 3,000 years already, killing and wounding thousands of their disciples and grand-disciples. However, their cultivation bases remained unaffected, even improving slowly and steadily. Indeed, their deceased underlings provided the best nutrition, and were much better for their reputation than occasionally devouring a great demon in secret. They would simply agree to a battle once every 800 to 1,000 years, creating an isolated small world and assuming their true forms to cause a huge ruckus. They would fight freely, not forgetting to obliterate 1 or 2 pseudo-celestial tools each, as well as a pile of useless immortal treasures they had received as tributes. Only when they had enough fun would they shatter the small world and purposely make themselves appear wounded and bloody. After all, both sides were keenly aware of their relatively similar combat power, so if they truly fought to the death, the other great demons sitting on the thrones in the ancient well would be more than happy to work together and dispose of them. This was especially the case regarding the skeletal great demon, who loved nothing more than to scheme in secret. Digging deep enough, one would find that many great demons in history had silently passed away while secretly nurturing their wounds. In reality, these great demons had already been refined into puppets. Thus, even though Great Demon Baiying didn't possess lofty combat power on the surface, his concealed potential was actually immense. The old man on the flying sword lightly patted his staff and commented, "Then things are quite interesting. I like this child, and I'll insist on giving him a greeting gift once we arrive in the majestic world." The woman in dragon robes and the old man on the flying sword could somewhat be viewed as semi-Dao partners, and the former said in amusement, "Are you worthy of joining the line to give a present to the old ancestor's closing disciple?" The old man chuckled and replied, "It's up to the child whether he accepts my present or not, and it's up to me whether I offer him a present or not. If he doesn't accept the present, then his soul can shatter and disperse again with a single staff strike. In any case, the majestic world is famous for its natural treasures, so it shouldn't be difficult to put together a body and a soul. Perhaps this child will become even more talented at that time, and the old ancestor might even thank me for helping. It's ultimately not the best for a master to kill his own disciple, after all." The little boy called Guanzhao suddenly cracked a grin. After some thought, it would be better for his first legitimate opponent after leaving the mountains to be Ning Yao. Sure enough, the other great demons received his secret message. The handsome great demon with a sword nurturing gourd at his hip took another glance at Ning Yao. feeling that they would receive more benefits if Ningyao were to participate in the battle. With this in mind, the handsome great demon patted his sword-nurturing gourd, summoning a streak of sword light that shot toward the troublesome young man who was delaying things for them. Only if Ningyao died on the battlefield beyond the city wall would he have the opportunity to peel off her face, along with the faces of the Azure Divine Mountains Goddess and Martial Goddess Pei Bei. Ningyao's face was also a supreme treasure that he was hellbent on obtaining. The sword light shot forward in a straight line after leaving the sword-nurturing gourd, and even though sword lights were often referred to as a thread, this one was actually as thick as a tree trunk, so abundant that it annihilated countless wisps of unstable sword intent that were initially flowing between heaven and earth. Moreover, the sword light was so quick that a wide ravine of over 10 meters deep only appeared on the ground after it was almost about to strike the young man in azure. Did this adhere to the rules of the battlefield? Did he care about his status as a paramount great demon? The savage world genuinely didn't care about these things. They had lost the wager of the 13 battles back then, but had Zhongguang and the other great demons taken this seriously and kept their promises? Of course not. Only the sword immortals and the majestic world had taken the wager seriously. After the savage world broke the solemn contract, the two great demons who had made the vow died instantly. Was this a big loss for the savage world? They were able to kill several sword immortals from the Sword Chi Great Wall, so what did it matter if a few more great demons were killed? The savage world could tolerate their deaths. What gave the savage world a headache was the majestic world relying on the Sword Chi Great Wall and the top-notch sword immortals to repel them, as each sword immortal who managed to survive a battle would become most powerful and troublesome in the subsequent battles. Both the savage world and the majestic world viewed a drop in cultivation base as the biggest tribulation in cultivation, but the so-called drop in cultivation bases at the Sword Chi Great Wall was almost never regarded as such. After unleashing a sword strike from his sword-nurturing gourd, the handsome great demon waited for the outcome. Victory was certain, and the only uncertainty was how overwhelming his victory would be. The old ancestor's disciple could continue to fight after the death of the young man in azure. After all, there was still Ningyao, wasn't there? Those at the Sword Chi Great Wall cared greatly about face, so much so that they would be willing to die for the sake of saving face. How could he provoke Chen Qingdu and have the old man attack him? At that time, the old ancestor definitely wouldn't hold back, and the two sides would descend into a chaotic battle without any additional schemes and plots. What did it matter if this led to another large-scale battle? Over at the city wall, Chen Qingdu was neither happy nor unhappy, and before the great demon had even reached down to pat his sword-nurturing gourd, he had already smiled and said, "Zuiyu, as his senior brother, it shouldn't be difficult for you to create a nice new battlefield for your junior brother, right? You can leave the city wall if the great demon takes things too far, and I'll personally watch over the battle and ensure your safety." Zuiyu nodded in response, and thus tens of thousands of wisps of soaring sword chi materialized in front of the ferocious sword light shooting toward Chen Pingan, instantly pulverizing it. "You're already getting involved? Isn't your opponent me?" The great demon that owned hundreds upon thousands of jade buildings didn't put away the ancient immortal residences that he had painstakingly collected, instead having them slowly circle around him like stars after he descended to the ground. He raised a hand, causing an ancient hall that was jade-white and the size of a palm to fly above the two people on the battlefield. It suddenly grew in size, blotting out the sky as it plummeted toward the little boy and the young man in azure, targeting both friend and foe. Zuiyu drew his sword, yet his sword intent didn't appear overwhelming at all. Instead, it felt silent and unmoving. He casually slashed down. The white jade hall that was as large as a mountain was sliced into two, and, not only that, but the remnant sword chi blasted the hall apart, causing huge rocks and shattered jade to rain down. The great demon that looked like an immortal didn't feel any sense of pity about this, clapping and laughing loudly as he praised impressive sword skills. "There's enough heft and power." The great demon then turned to the big bearded man carrying a sword by his hip and a sword on his back and asked, "What do you think? I'll let you deal with this sword cultivator who has the right to stand beside Chen Qingdu? I'll let Zuiyu kill you before I exact revenge for you." The big bearded man replied in an apathetic voice, "You can shut up if you want to thank me, or else it will be the Sword Chi Great Wall thanking me in a moment." The great demon sighed in grief and lamented, "No matter how I look at it, It won't be a good deal for me even if I manage to kill Zuoyu. After all, the archways at the southern world continent's pure Confucian Chan clan are relatively new structures no matter how good they might look. On the other hand, these ancient structures in my cherished collection are all unique ones that I'm especially fond of. They'll be gone once I use them, and there's nothing I can replace them with. Sure enough, sword cultivators like you are more direct and unrestrained, never needing to consider these gains and losses when you battle. Over at the city wall, Peng Yuanji appeared slightly angry as he said in a solemn voice, "These great demons are purposely stepping forward to help that little brat create a particular atmosphere, and they intend to use this to suppress Chen Pingan's mental state." There was a serious expression on Chen Sancho's face. This was the battlefield of the Sword Qi Great Wall. Those who charged forward and fought based on emotions alone would often suffer tragic fates. Indeed, the demon tribes of the savage world loved nothing more than sword cultivators who acted on emotion. When war broke out, one would find it incredibly difficult to feel satisfied if they felt like they could overcome all enemies with nothing but themselves and their sword, even if they were an upper 5-tier sword immortal. This would only help the demon tribe succeed, gifting them one or even a string of victories in battle. Many great demons would purposely scheme and hold severely wounded sword cultivators in their hands, slowly tearing off their limbs one by one and loudly crunching down on them. Alternatively, they might slowly skin the sword cultivators and pluck out their tendons. There were a myriad of torturous methods that the great demons would employ, so bloody and painful that the captured sword cultivators would suffer a pain worse than death. After being caught and having their souls suppressed, however, even trying to commit suicide would become nothing more than a fanciful dream. The great demons engaged in this cruel practice for the sake of luring more sword cultivators from the Sword Qi Great Wall, where they would take the risk to venture deep into the savage world to exact revenge. The great demons would naturally lie in waiting and instantly surround the sword immortals, overwhelming them and killing them. Afterward, they would divide the military merit evenly among themselves. These bloody and tragic lessons had been taught many times over the course of history. When young and prodigious sword cultivators were captured, their clan elders or Dao mentors would charge over in a bid to rescue them. When the latter were killed, sword immortals would venture to the savage world to exact revenge. When these sword immortals were killed, their close friends would also charge into the savage world in anger. Yet they would also face death. In the end, the young sword cultivators would end up dying last. One time, the young sword cultivators hadn't been killed by the great demons in the end, and the limbless youths with shattered flying swords had been unceremoniously tossed to the ground. The great demons had ordered their underlings to walk around them when retreating, leaving these broken prodigies to the Sword Qi Great Wall. With the bonded flying swords pulverized and their bridge of immortality comprehensively shattered, those who could muster some strength would choose to kill themselves on the battlefield. Otherwise, they would commit suicide a bit later after being carried away from the battlefield and back to the city. The savage world only cared about victory and defeat, life and death. They never cared about the means or the process. Then they're going to regret this, Ningyao replied. Zuoyu raised his sword and pointed its tip at the great demon that had unleashed the White Jade Hall. Several huge vortexes appeared in front of the old man in gray and the 14 paramount great demons, with sword tips ripping through the void and slowly thrusting forward. It was as if 15 small worlds had suddenly materialized between the savage world and the Sword Qi Great Wall. Sword Immortals Zuoyu of the majestic world was essentially challenging all 15 great demons at once. No matter one's cultivation base, everyone from both the savage world and the Sword Qi Great Wall was keenly aware of one fact. With regard to today's battle, the more powerful and eye-catching a sword cultivator was, the more likely they were to die on the battlefield. Those who initially didn't need to die were seeking death, while those who could have died later were seeking a quicker death. First it was Chen Pingan, and then it was Zuoyu. Sure enough, those belonging to the scholarly lineage never acted in a reasonable manner.